and the sector. That means that we've gathered both two groups. We have three universities. It means the University of Brighton from UK, Paderborn University from Germany, and Palacký University in Olomouc from the Czech Republic. And we have also four NGOs as partners: Czech INEX SDA, Football for Hope, Peace and Unity from the UK, MSIS from Mragowo in Poland, and Play Handball, residing in Oldenburg in Germany, but with most of the activities in South Africa. We have also several, we call them associated partners. It means partners who participate on specific occasions. We have two Olympic committees, national Olympic committees, the Czech Olympic Committee and German Olympic Sports Federation. And we have also as a partner, as an associated partner, Swiss Academy for Development, running the well-known platform Sport and Dev. We have also academic associates. These are experts, lecturers, who participate each year on specific seminars, on specific online lessons, both offline and online. Last year it was Billy Graef from Rio Grande Federal University, Rio Grande in Brazil, Robert Reinhardt from Waikato University in New Zealand. This year we welcomed Dongjin Kim from Trinity College in Dublin, and Nico Schulenko from Technical University of Sydney. And we hope that the last year, the next year, last year of the project, we welcome Cora Burnett from University of Johannesburg and Simon Darnell from Toronto University. And as I said, one of the main ideas of the project is to bring together universities and NGOs in a field of sport for development, to share practical experience and theoretical expertise. And of course, we are in Erasmus Plus program, so one of our main goals is to bring all these experience and expertise to our students. They form international groups, students from Czech Republic, Germany, and the UK, taking part in joint programs, in field trips. And as a third point, we try also to foster the discussion, the communication between various partners in the SDP sector, in the sport for development sector. And we try to establish best practice for teaching SDP in higher education. We circulated a survey for educators, trying to formulate some basic information about what sport for development in the teaching process means for our colleagues, for our partners. So what we've done so far, here on the left and right side, you can see some pictures from our first and last offline gathering with our students. It was last year in Olomouc in Czech Republic. In the middle, you can see a picture from this year's series of seminar for students, which of course had to take the online form. And what we are planning to do, we would like to organize several field trips if the pandemic situation will be kind to us, to Berlin, possibly to Belfast, to Brussels, where also our final conference should take place. So hopefully we will be able to meet at least some of you in Brussels the next year. We would like to organize one intensive teaching week for students next year, in Paderborn. And at the end, we would like to produce a dissemination report, including the best practice, including the survey results, and depicting the conception of sport for development as is being used by the educators in universities, in organizations delivering some teaching products to their clients. So that's all for me. Thank you very much, and please enjoy today's program.
Well, thank you, Arnost, for providing some context for what the day is all about and what the project is all about. My name is Thomas Carter, and I am a colleague of Mark Deutsch's at the University of Brighton, and am one of the people involved with the GloKnoCo project as well. My role here at the moment then is to chair the first keynote address and introduce our speaker. We are quite pleased and honored to have, excuse me, to have Morten Schmidt from Laureus Sport for Good, one of the most prominent and probably well-known organizations within the sector of sport for development and peace. He is the global director of programs and, oh, I'm going to forget the last part here, and grants.
Grants,
yes.
That's the
Thank
important
you,
thing.
The way I will run this particular session then is Morten will speak for approximately 30 minutes or however long he chooses around that number. And then we will open it up for questions for Morten after that. If you would like to have questions or something of that sort, you could either write them in the chat and I can ask them for you, or please put your hands up and I will get to you as quickly as I can. I am anticipating we will probably have more questions than time, so it may be best to put them in chat and we can put them to Morten as well during the rest of the session. So with that in mind, Morten, the last thing then, please, if everyone could make sure that they have their microphones off. And the second thing is there will be a form coming through about your attendance here. And we would ask that you fill this form out. It will be put in the group chat, I believe. And this is crucial for evidence to give to Erasmus Plus of the attendees who attended this particular event. And it has to do with our reporting for the funding that we have received. So it is important for us if you could please help us out with that and fill that out online. It's an online form, shouldn't take more than a minute or two at some point during the day. So thank you very much. And I will turn it over to Morten.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, everyone. I can hear an echo in, now it disappeared. Thank you. Thanks, Thomas. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me into your collaborative, even if for only 45 minutes or up to an hour or something along those lines. And thank you, Thomas, for reaching out and inviting me to take part in this session. As you can imagine, after a year in COVID world, we have a lot to share. So I will see if I can keep it comparatively short. My slides, which I will be sharing shortly, are quite packed, some of them. Might not look very good, but we do have a lot of things we want to share regarding the state of the sector, the sport for development and peace sector right now in pandemic and post-pandemic world. Before getting started, I will try to share a 1-minute video that will take up some of my 30 minutes. Let me see if I can figure it out. At this point in time, of course, we should all be completely fluent in Zoom. Not entirely, but I think you should be able to see my screen now, and hopefully you'll be able to hear the sound as well.
We can't hear the sound.
Oh, you can't hear the sound?
No, in case you're using you're not using earphones or anything, right? Is it sometimes the problem?
I do use earphones, but maybe I can
maybe then unplug them. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, now it works. Sorry, I thought it would work, but it still doesn't. Maybe otherwise, since it's a YouTube, maybe you can just share the link with us and then everyone watch it on their own pace.
I'm sorry, sometimes when you are sharing, there is also an option just that you want to share also the sound. Maybe that could be a problem.
I think he can't hear us anymore because he has no earphones in anymore.
Well, it's over in a second, so. Morten, I'm afraid we still weren't able to hear you. Maybe you can quickly share the link in the post. I mean, it's just a short video, so everyone can watch on their own page.
Hello again. Can you hear me again?
Yes, we can, but we couldn't hear.
Because now I can't hear you. So that was not a very successful introduction. Let me see what I can do with my sound.
Can you hear me, Morten? You would probably need to put your earphones in again.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
But I still can't hear you.
Okay, Mark, can you maybe write Morten that you would need to put in the earphones in again?
Yes.
You know what? I will disconnect very quickly and then connect again, and then we'll get rolling.
Okay.
Tom, welcome.
All right. Well, I guess although we should be fluent in Zoom, it's clear that technical difficulties do arise even when we plan for the best of times. So we'll just hang on a second here and wait for Morten to come back.
I'm back. Hello. Sorry
Hello.
for all this mess.
No worries, Morten. Maybe you can quickly share the link of the YouTube video and then everyone can watch by him or herself.
Yeah, I can do that at some point. You don't need to sit and watch it now. And in any case, images speak louder than words, they say.
Yeah.
So let's just go on with it. I'm sure Thomas would also sit and stress if we were to start disconnecting and watch our individual videos and get all kinds of problems related to that. Let me jump straight into what I want to share with you guys today. Many of you probably know us already. Laureus Sport for Good has been around for many years, for 21 years now. We were formed back in 2000 at the inaugural Laureus World Sports Awards in Monaco. And we were formed as part of the Laureus family, which is essentially three different things. The Laureus World Sports Academy, which is this pantheon of elite athletes from times gone by, including some of the greatest stars from sports from the last 50, 60 years. Then we have the Laureus World Sports Awards, which is this annual recurring event handing out awards to strong performances over the past year. And then we have the Laureus Sport for Good Foundation, where I get into the picture. In spite of Thomas's struggle with the title, I am the Global Director of Programs and Grants. And I oversee all the program and grants work that we do across the world, from the global office in London, where I'm based, and through national foundations in a number of different countries as well. And it all started with Nelson Mandela on the stage. Most of you probably know his speech, or you have seen it referred to from different organizations in different settings. It's the speech that gave much of the sport for development space its ethos, and most certainly Laureus Sport. It's one of you guys that currently has a microphone activated that makes a lot of noise. Okay, I'll continue. I'll try to continue. Started with Nelson Mandela on the stage, giving the speech about the power of sport and how it is stronger than so many different ways of working with children and young people. That it is an approach to social development that we need to take into consideration, that we need to work with. And this has served as the ethos for Laureus for many, many years. And now we're operating under the vision of using the power of sport to end discrimination, disadvantage, and violence. We work under the UN Sustainable Development Goals in a number of different social focus areas where we, from experience, from research that we have conducted, from research conducted across the sector, where we can see that a sports-based approach has a particularly strong role. And that includes education, it includes obviously health, and in our case, particularly around mental health and well-being. It includes gender equality and gender justice. It includes employability and getting young people on a sustainable livelihoods track. And it goes into areas such as inclusion, inclusive societies, and peaceful societies as well. And we work, broadly speaking, in 3 different mission work streams. One, we support programs and grants. And we do it in 2 different ways. We do it in a number of different ways, but boiled down to the essentials. One, we provide funding to organizations, to sport for development organizations, or rather sport for development programs, which in many cases are implemented by sport for development organizations, and in a few cases by other types of entities, buying into this sports-based approach to youth development. We also provide technical assistance to our partner organizations across the world. So we don't only provide funding, we work together with individual partner organizations, either in a one-to-one relationship, providing technical assistance and technical support in a number of different areas, including safeguarding, financial management, fundraising, good governance, etc., etc., etc. We also work through larger program frameworks that are based in geographic locations. We call them collective impact, place-based programs. In the US, we launched it about 6 years ago in New Orleans, and then it started growing, replicating to other cities, where we get together with a large number of organizations and facilitate an approach and a collaboration that lets these organizations decide what's best for them, for their communities, let them set the objectives for the programs, and we then provide funding and other types of support for them to do what they want to do. But there's a lot of collaboration there, and technical assistance is most often delivered at a collective level to the entire group of organizations. That's the first one. The second one, strengthening the sport for development community, takes different shapes and forms. One, we have developed a quite elaborate key performance indicator framework to measure the impact of sport for development interventions across the world. This didn't exist 5 years ago. And for us, we started developing it about 4 years ago, the process started. And in 2019, we published our first ever impact review of all the programs that we've been supporting across the world, based on more than 70 different key performance indicators, of which we have selected the most significant ones and tell the narrative around those ones. We have continued to develop this framework, and this is now the cornerstone in all our knowledge production and all our contributions to the sport for development sector. But we also invest more specifically in individual pieces of research. We are soon going to launch a new piece that is addressing how sport for development programs can work more inclusively with the LGBTQI+ community. We have invested in the last few years in research on how to engage with young people living with disabilities in sport development programs and what kind of impact they're having on their lives. We have invested a lot around employability, inclusion, and on gender justice as well over the last few years. So we produce a lot of knowledge, we produce a lot of information, and we also create spaces where a lot of that information can be exchanged and further information and further data can be developed. We orchestrate something we call the learning communities that involve organizations working in distinct social themes, whether it's education or employability or something else. And we facilitate a process with topical experts to develop their understanding of how best to evidence the impact they're having, but also going into discussing best practices in delivering sports-based programs to achieve certain social outcomes. And occasionally we host global communities as well. The last one was in Paris 2018. We were supposed to have had one last year, but for obvious reasons that never really did happen, did it? So strengthening the sport for development community, and then based on these two first mission work streams, we do a lot of influencing and advocacy work to mobilize more international stakeholders to invest in sport for development, and contributing to all sorts of different things done at international levels to advance the sport for development agenda. I think the last major thing we did was contributing to the UN General Secretary's report to the General Assembly in July last year about the role of sport and sport for development in recovering from COVID. Currently, just to finish the presentation of Laureus, we support well over 200 programs in currently well over 40 countries across the world. Our response to COVID-19, well, first and foremost, one of the big things we had to do last year when the pandemic struck, starting initially in Asia and then rolling from east to west and from north to south. One was to understand how the pandemic is affecting our partners and the programs, and not least the participants. And we started a process analyzing all our 200 plus partners across the world on how they were reacting in the situation, what was happening with children and young people in their communities, what were they planning to do now that they couldn't do what they were used to do with these people any longer. We also started realizing that we were absolutely not experts in dealing with a pandemic. We're still no experts in dealing with a pandemic, but what we can do is to connect organizations working on the ground and facilitate sharing of experiences, sharing of tools, sharing of coping strategies, making sure that organizations never feel left alone, making sure that there's always inspiration out there to access for organizations wanting to do a difference in the local community. We then also provided tailored support to all of our grantees by adjusting grant budgets, work plans, target participation numbers, which obviously was affected by not being able to do the usual thing, and changes in monitoring and evaluation and learning frameworks as well. It's not quite fair to go out with the same type of indicators to measure interventions that are fundamentally very, very different from what they initially set out to do. We also fairly early on launched something we call the Sport for Good Response Fund. We went together with Beyond Sport, which most of you probably also know. We partnered to deliver grants and technical assistance to the sport for development community in this critical situation, providing support to doing two different things. In the one end, a lot of organizations were struggling. They needed funding to survive. They needed funding to retain staff. Even if they weren't able to deliver, then they were still in need of additional financial support. So we kind of invested in helping some of these organizations to survive, knowing that at the other end of the tunnel, there would be a need for these organizations to pick up the pieces after lockdowns, after restrictions, etc. But we also invested possibly a major chunk in developing new approaches to deliver programs. Innovation in the context of the pandemic, different types of ways that programs could be adapted to being delivered in different types of context, different types of restrictions, different types of infrastructure access, etc. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this in the presentation. I'm more focused at the other end, towards the end of the tunnel that I will come back to. But if you want to learn more, then in the next month or so, I think we'll be launching our 2020 annual review. And there you can read a bit more about the report. And Beyond Sport and us are also launching a separate report on the response fund that will also be publicly available. And we hosted virtual events and we engaged our global stakeholders, our global network, to ensure continued support and commitment throughout the crisis. Impact numbers were quietly down or slightly down last year, from directly impacting 330 something children and young people, or 340,000 children and young people in 2019 to 270,000 directly impacted in 2020, but also reaching more than 800,000 children and young people through different types of interventions. Now, to the juicy part of the keynote speech. Impacts on programs from restrictions. We effectively did start doing a bit of research recently on how all of these organizations have been affected over the course of the pandemic. Not just the initial blow, but the longer term effects, and some of the effects that we're now seeing coming out of lockdown as well. And it's some of these things that I'm going to talk to you about for the next 10 to 15 minutes. You can see that, Tom, I'm already squeezing it a little bit, so it won't be 30 minutes, be a bit more than 30 minutes probably. Well, one of the things is that programs working through schools, and as I'm sure many of you will know, a lot of sport for development is being delivered through schools. They have been especially difficult for these programs. They have very limited ability to get in touch with participants since the very first lockdowns. It's not because they haven't tried, but for different statutory reasons, that data and that information is not accessible to them. So they have been delivering highly innovative, extremely impactful programs all the way up to when lockdown was first put in place in whatever country we're talking about. And from that moment on, they've been struggling in getting out and reaching the children and young people who were in need of their support. We all know of all the secondary effects of the pandemic on mental health, on abuse, on intra-family violence, in wider gender-based violence, in unemployment, etc. There's been a lot of need for this type of interventions out there, but organizations working through schools have been struggling. Organizations and programs that have depended on other institutions for infrastructure access, for access to facilities, are also struggling, obviously, for all of the reasons that you know about restrictions, lockdowns, etc. And another thing that has affected many organizations are the constantly changing public restrictions. When you deliver a program, you need to be able to anticipate what you can do and what you can't do. And all of these constantly changing restrictions are really difficult in the one end to keep track of, but also it creates instability in the context of delivery of program, meaning that programs are struggling with being or delivering their curriculum in a meaningful way and addressing all the issues that children and young people have been struggling with throughout the pandemic. So once starting a program, you would want to deliver it as planned. Otherwise, you create these failed expectations among children and young people, and they don't necessarily appreciate all the complexities linked to public management of a pandemic. And that can be detrimental at so many different levels and have proven to be detrimental at many different levels. So in particular for small organizations, this has been an uphill struggle for them. Small organizations with few coaches are also extremely vulnerable to just one of their coaches testing positive. That might put a program into full stop for 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks. And again, impacting back into how programs are delivered and creating this instability and unintended secondary impacts of lack of program delivery. Retaining staff is a huge challenge as well, as you can imagine. Many of these organizations, if they don't deliver, they don't get funding. If they don't have funding, they can't retain staff. So making sure that coaches, volunteers, administration, management, all people that have been trained and developed to deliver particular methodologies, particular programs, particular curricula, all of these have been extremely hit by or deeply hit and deeply affected by the pandemic and by the restrictions, and organizations are struggling. Also, something as simple as hygiene-related costs that organizations are no longer have never been used to investing heavily in before has all of a sudden become a new budget line in their program planning. Restrictions on group sizes has had an effect that programs reach fewer children and young people. As you can see, even from our global perspective, we went down from 340,000 to 270,000 people. Young children, young people who participate in an ongoing, purposeful sport for development program. And all throughout the sector, we see drops in participant numbers. We might see increases in participant numbers on activities that have been delivered through Zoom or other online devices. But the depth of that impact is very difficult to evidence for these organizations. So in general, we see drops in impact numbers. And at the same time, it implies that with fewer kids participating, but the same amount of staff needed to deliver the activities, you see that the cost per participant or the cost per beneficiary skyrockets throughout the crisis. And in some cases, excuse me, we also see a reduced community outreach from these programs. I'm not going to talk a lot about what the organizations or what the sector has done in terms of adapting throughout the crisis. I'm sure you have already discussed and exchanged many of these things. You can read more about it in the response fund report and in our annual review coming, and there are many other things out there you can access. But I just want to tie a little knot around online programming, or just give a little note on online programming, which seems to have taken the sector by storm. But which does come with some additional challenges that needs to be addressed if this is ever going to evolve into an integral part of the sport for development space. First and foremost, safeguarding. When the pandemic struck last year, and we saw half of the partners that we were working with wanting to move online with their programs, the alarm bell rang immediately, because these are entirely new types of risks associated with safeguarding that comes from changing the venue from the pitch or the track or the field to online delivery. So safeguarding is an area that is way underexplored and that needs to be developed if the sport for development space wants to integrate more in online activities. Second, don't overestimate the value of someone holding a phone in their hand. It doesn't mean that they have internet access. It doesn't mean that they have Wi-Fi. It doesn't mean that they can access online activities. When you come from poor and disenfranchised communities, often you won't have Wi-Fi at home, not even in countries like the UK or the Czech Republic. You won't necessarily have Wi-Fi at home. You might have a smartphone, but it most likely comes with a prepaid subscription with very, very limited data package, meaning you can't really spend 2, 3, 4 hours a week on an online training activities. Even more so if this is a phone that's shared between several family members. So very careful about overestimating the access that children and young people have to internet. In some cases they do, in many cases they don't. And then also, we're now, more or less 1.5 years into the pandemic, with the first lockdown starting in Asia, starting in Hong Kong in early January last year, at least in our universe. There's been a lot of online delivery, and we do begin to see in some countries some level of online fatigue, that they don't connect as easily to these kind of programs any longer. Declining numbers in participants through these kind of efforts. And this might be something to take into consideration as well when we think about, we need to take everything online, we need to integrate online engagement as well with children and young people. Yeah, we probably do, but we need to be very careful about how we do it, and we need to explore other complementary ways of doing it as well, such as radio and television, such as using old-fashioned phone communication, not necessarily online phone communication, such as developing curricula that children and young people can use for themselves at home or supervised by their parents or their guardians. Coming out of lockdown, again, there's a number of different issues that we're looking at. One of the big challenges that we could see coming out from the first lockdown last summer was that even if children and young people had only been in lockdown for 3-4 months, some signs of a sedentary lifestyles was beginning to develop, leading to greater efforts needed in getting kids and young people back to the programs. And in some instances, the Response Fund provided funding for organizations to find a way of re-engaging, reconnecting with children and young people, trying to start getting them physically active again. But it is, and it remains a challenge across the sector. For more than a year now, children and young people have had significant reduction in accessing sporting activities, which is a challenge that we need to address as a sector. Some places, part of the answer to financial challenges, and this was something that came as a bit of a surprise to me when we did the research. Sports venues, owners of sport venues, they of course have been equally impacted by the crisis. They've had huge drops in income, so they now need to figure out how to recover those losses in running their venues. And quite often, pay and play pays better than a sports for development program. So we see in many cases that sport for development organizations who depend on these venues, who have rental agreement with these kind of venues, they are being set aside by the owners of venues because there's more profit to gain from pay and play. And that again mean, even if we're out of lockdown, they still don't have access to venues. They still struggle with some of the same issues they had when the very strict restrictions were put in place a year ago. And another big thing, and it's certainly one I can see on my own daughter's access to physical education in school. Physical education has been cut in many countries. In the UK, it's been cut by as much as 50%. So children who before had 2 hours a week, they now have 1 hour a week. And if we take out the time it takes to dress before and after, or to change before and after, it essentially means that they might have 2 times 20 to 25 minutes per week, which in total adds up to less than the 1 hour recommended per day by the WHO. So drop down, deprioritization in schools of physical activity, making it continue to be difficult for the organizations who depend on schools and physical education to deliver their programs. I think 2 important things to take out for the sector is that programs, sport for development programs, possibly increasingly need to try and understand where children and young people are coming from. And there's a lot of pressure on children and young people now to make sure they catch up academically. That was the reason why schools and educational sector is now deprioritizing physical education, is because it doesn't really give you any academic credits. So how can we deliver programs while supporting children to catch up with the academic agenda in schools? I think that's an important challenge to address for the sector. And another one is obviously employment. Youth unemployment has also exploded throughout the pandemic. They were the first or the last to join the labor market, and they were the first to leave the labor market. And drop in available job opportunities has been cut in, or available job opportunities has been in many countries cut in half over the course of the pandemic, making it even more difficult for children and young people to get access to labor market. In many communities, it was already difficult. Even in developed economy, even going to Paris, to some of the more disenfranchised areas in Paris, we had before the pandemic youth unemployment rates exceeding 40%. That has worsened. The situation is appalling right now to be a young person wanting to create a sustainable livelihood. And as a sector, we need to also figure out a way to address that. And then again, I do need to mention it again before we all run off wanting to do online activities. We need to understand it better, and we need to understand why the enthusiasm linked to online delivery seems to be quite significantly dropping now. Funding, very quickly, you all know that funding has been heavily affected. Most of it is bleak, but there are a few optimistic things to note from it as well. Well, reduced funding due to donors canceling grants and funding commitments, leading to difficulties of retaining staff, as I mentioned, delivering programs, covering core costs. And even in a context where the cost per beneficiary is increasing, this becomes even worse for the organizations. Many organizations live from doing public fundraising activities such as events or collections, different types of activities. All of that has been put on hold for a long period. We also feel it in Laureus. We also do fundraising activities. We do annual activities in Hong Kong, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars. Last year, nothing happened. So we are also, in a few contexts, we're also running on fumes, so to speak. No income from commercial activities for the organizations who had been developing this strain of income. And then a lot of funding in the development space are going towards humanitarian interventions, are going towards addressing direct and indirect impacts of COVID. And this can lead to closures of organizations who no longer have access to funding, or it can lead to mission drifting, taking them away from what they really should be doing in terms of addressing all the secondary and tertiary effects of COVID-19 on mental health and well-being, on unemployment, etc. And then there is an indirect, or it's actually a quite direct impact from organizations that are not humanitarians, who do not have humanitarian training, to try and become humanitarian, to go into communities heavily affected by COVID-19 and become source of further spreading the disease. All good reasons for not becoming humanitarian, while still being able to support these kind of initiatives. Finally, there are some opportunities coming from the crisis, and that is with funding drifting elsewhere, it gives organizations in our space a chance to rethink the way that we are presenting and talking about our programs. So we might want to move away from talking about the sports as the entry point to talking about the social change, and putting the sports-based approach in that context rather than the social change in the context of sports. And that way, all of a sudden, it's not small pots focused on using sports that we can access, but it's wider social development pots, which then requires of us to be better at articulating and phrasing the work that we're doing. Call to action, Tom, I'm getting to the end. We need to generate more funding for a struggling sector. That kind of goes almost without saying, but I did mention it a few times. I think we do need to campaign for getting physical education back full in the school calendar, at least back full in the school calendar. We need to campaign for physical activity and the role for sport and sport for development in a post-pandemic world. This is what we did with the UN. This is what we're doing with the Everyone Wins campaign, of which the video you saw but didn't hear in the beginning is a part. You can find it in all our social media platforms if you want to learn more about it. For us as a donor, we need to extend grant periods to allow for organizations to transition out of lockdown and restrictions. We also need to be flexible towards what the organizations are doing, including on data collection, which is more difficult for organizations in the current climate. We need to accept that the cost efficiency of interventions is negatively impacted while public health restrictions remain in place. It's not 3 hours ago I was sitting and having these kind of conversations, and I can feel on myself that I'm certainly becoming more tolerant in the cost per beneficiaries that we are accepting. And we should continue supporting safeguarding measures in a changing environment, in particular around the online services, but also the multitude of different settings we're now delivering programs in. And then finally, we need to research if the landscape is really changing towards digital or if it's not. And if it is changing, then explore how to make the best of it. And with that said, Thomas, I got to the end. Anyone who have any questions are also very welcome to look me up. I'm in Twitter, in Facebook, in LinkedIn, and you can easily find me there. So feel free to connect and ask any kind of question.
Okay. I want to thank you very much, Morten, for that very broad and informative talk. Ask if everybody it's difficult to do online, but if you can use your emojis to at least give a visual round of applause for Morten for that very interesting talk, that would be most appreciated. We have a couple of questions that have been typed in the chat as we have gone on, as you've been talking here. And so I want to get to one or two of those. The first one that came through from Maria Berman, actually, it was rather specific. So I want to go to one in particular that she talked about and asked is, you mentioned focusing on social change instead of focusing on sport for organizations. What does that then mean for the activities on the ground? Are you talking about changing the activities and approaches then with vulnerable groups, or are you talking about something else?
I think it's a really good question. I think we should always strive not to base our interventions on assumptions, but base it on evidence as much as we possibly can. And we have been a sector that has very much been driven by assumptions about impact and assumptions about effect. Just delivering sport, we think, okay, but then by default, there will be a positive impact. We can't make certain of that. We need to explore and we need to understand what it is we are doing. And once we have a solid way of delivering programs, delivering curricula, then if we then look back to how our sector conventionally has been funded, it has to a great extent been funded because of the sport part, more than because of the social change part. So many of the sponsors, the big sponsors in the sport for development space, are sponsors that buys into the delivery of sport. You can see if you go to, let's take one of the big institutions that ties all of you guys together, European Commission. Funding for the European Commission comes typically from the Directorate General of Culture, Education and Sport. It's very, very little funding that goes from the Directorate General of Development Cooperation, DevCo. It's the entity for international development outside of Europe. In culture, sports and education, where you get your funding from, the discourse is anchored in the delivery of sport to create social change, and funding is reserved to delivery of sports programs. But there's no reason for why we can't approach someone like the Director General of Development Cooperation and say, we are going to deliver a huge employability or livelihoods program, sustainable livelihoods program in East Africa, and then tap into funding which are reserved for livelihoods programs in East Africa. So it's no longer the sport that drives the conversation. The sport becomes our methodology, and it becomes a legitimate methodology. But the conversation with the European Commission is not so much about the sports as it is about creating sustainable livelihoods. So that's what I mean. It's changing the way that, no, not changing, it is expanding the way we talk about our programs. That with some donors, yes, we know and we appreciate that it's the sports-based approach that's the key to talking with these donors, but with other donors, it is the improved educational attainment. It's the improved livelihoods for young people that drives the conversation. So that's what I mean. It's not a matter of changing what we're doing. It's a matter of adapting it to those different contexts. And I think with a reduced funding, going into the sport for development space, and with more funding going into other spaces, well, maybe we need to figure out how do we articulate what we're doing in some of these other spaces to access funding. So that's what I mean with new opportunities. It's not changing what we're doing. It's being better at adapting our conversation about what we're doing to different settings and to different donor environments. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. And actually, that response sort of segues very nicely into a couple of questions here. I'm going to ask both of these questions because they relate to each other and to what you just sort of articulated. We have one of the questions is then, from what you just said, do you think that sport for development is fully accepted by and integrated into the larger world of international development and the larger sector in that. And then on top of that, then, do you have any thoughts or do you have any thoughts on what direction you see the sector of SDP in particular going in the future? And I know you just addressed part of that, but perhaps you might address that a bit more based on what you said with your talk in terms of advising the UN on the role sport can play in international development and that sort of track as well.
Well, I don't think it's fully accepted at all. Let's just be honest.
Okay.
It's still a small niche. It's a small niche that has been struggling with evidencing its impact. It's a small niche, as I said earlier, that has been driven very much by assumptions. But I think different things are happening, which makes us a little bit more house trained, so to speak, in international development. One, the sector is increasingly aligning with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And anything in international development up until 2030 will align itself with the Sustainable Development Goals. Most countries have strategies to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals. So the moment we start articulating what we're doing in that context, doors will start to open. So that was a good thing. Another good thing is that we are investing more and more in more rigorous research. From Laureus a few years ago, we did a study together with Adelphi University in the US to try and get an overview of the quality of the evidence in the sport for development space. And it was a very depressing message that came out. The vast majority of research, and they looked at more than 100 different pieces of research. It's not very transparent. We're not very clear about its methodologies. From a scientific perspective, it's on very, very shaky ground. So we need to be better at employing more rigorous methodologies. Not necessarily naturalistic methodologies, but be better at explaining the methodologies we use and be more transparent about them. And thereby start producing more quality research, more quality evidence of the impact that we're having as a sector. So those are a couple of things that are happening. There are some negative things that are happening as well. If, for instance, looking at education, one of the first victims in the curricula was physical education. So clearly it's still something that's very down on public sector priority lists. It's not being given the priority that we would like it to be given. Knowing the kind of impact that participation in physical activities and sports activities can have on your educational attainment. That's a negative side, but then turning it around and looking at the wider UN system, we can see that different offices across the UN are increasingly beginning to take up sports-based approaches to deliver programs. UNIFEM has been doing it for, oh, not UNIFEM, that was the old name, UN Women, sorry. There you can see I've revealed my age here. UN Women have been doing it for a few years, linking to the legacy programs of the Olympics. UN Office on Drug and Crime deliver a very successful program in partnership with governments and civil society organizations across the world to reduce crime and violence. The UN Alliance of Civilizations, which is a program directly under the UN General Secretary, are beginning to look into, as of last year, they have started looking into sports-based programs. So little by little, it's spreading. And we can see that we're now having conversations with institutions that we didn't have 5 years ago. We're in conversations with the Inter-American Development Bank, with the World Bank, with the French development agencies, stakeholders that normally haven't really given much thought about the power of sport as a tool for social development. So I think it's spreading, it's happening slowly, but we have done a few good things that's helping us on that track, such as aligning with the Sustainable Development Goals, such as improving the evidence base, such as changing the discourse towards social development instead of just talking about sport. No offense to the sports nerds out there.
No, that I'm sure there isn't any offense taken by that in particular. I'm acutely aware of the time, and as is per usual, when you open up to questions, as you start talking and answering questions, questions then start coming faster and more intensely, and we don't have time. So what we are proposing is that we will send all of the questions that are put into the chat to the speakers of the conference and that sort of thing, and for those to you for the opportunity to respond to them in your own time as you can then, if that's all right with you, Morten.
That's fine. As I say, you can also find me on LinkedIn or Facebook or wherever you can find me on social
I think there's
media.
some fantastic questions. I wish we had time to discuss in more detail. We just simply do not. Is there something you wanted to add?
Just that I think you're going to see one of my colleagues later today, Amanda Lima, who works in my team.
Yes.
Feel free to ask her all those questions. I'm sure she will also be good at answering them.
Okay, which would be great. But the panel, and that's what the panel is for, as well as is a more Q&A type of session and that sort of thing. So lastly, then I want to thank you again, Morten, for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us today. I know you have a quite busy schedule today, as you do most days. And once again, just a virtual round of applause for our esteemed guest. I'm going to propose, we're running a little bit late as is per usual with online conferences already. Mark, if this seems all right with you, I think I'm going to propose a 5-minute break since we aren't going to have quite as many presentations as we thought. So we'll take a 5-minute break and come back at, would that be 7 past by my clock? Is that all right? So if everybody wants to turn off cameras and go stretch and move around, get a glass of water, try to avoid screen fatigue and that sort of thing. We'll see you back shortly in about 5 minutes. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Morten. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Recording.
hello everyone. Many thanks, Anos, for the slide, and welcome back. As Tom said, and well, as Morten said in his own presentation about screen fatigue, we're very careful, and we recognise that these online conferences can be quite tiring. There's a lot of attention and a lot of work that goes into them. So we do want to build in a break after each of the sessions. As I mentioned, and as part of the project, as Anos pointed out in the first session, GloKnoCo is partly about collaboration with partners, but it's also about student engagement. And it was designed as an opportunity for students from the 3 host universities to be able to travel to each of the different locations and benefit from meeting colleagues around the world and visiting new places in the Czech Republic, in the UK, and in Germany. As obviously goes without saying, COVID has completely sort of blown all that out of the water. So unfortunately, this is why we're actually having an online conference rather than in person as part of our course. So as part of our course, the students we had an online course over the course of 4 weeks, the intensive course. The students were also tasked with developing a proposal, working with our partners on a particular project or issue that they have raised as an issue. We have 4 of the student groups here who are going to present their work. Each presentation will be 5 minutes, and we have 5 minutes for questions. I will have to be quite tight, because what that will do, that should mean is that we'll have 40 minutes, which gives us time to finish before 3 o'clock UK time, 4 o'clock Central European time, which means we have a nice break before the panel that comes on at in an hour's time, or just under an hour's time. So the order of the student presentations will be the first group, which will be the Football for Peace project. The second one is the MSIS project, working with Alec. The third one was going to be Play Handball, who were unfortunately unable to do this today. So the third one will now be INEX. We've been working with Ansley. And the fourth one, as will be now, is the one with Football, Hope, Peace and Unity. So I don't know who is leading on the Football for Peace one, but if you can get your slides ready, and you'll have 5 minutes, I will call you in. I will sort of give you some indication that 5 minutes are up, and then if you can wrap up, then we'll open up to questions. As before, if you add your questions to the chat, and then we can ask them as they go. So who's leading on the Football for Peace presentation?
Hi, so I think all the group will present some points. We will try to be fast as possible. So I will start sharing the screen.
Thanks, Rowan.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So we are really glad to be the first group to present his project, and we are really excited to hear from other projects. As you all know, we did this project for Football for Peace organization. So for those people who are attending from outside the project, I will briefly talk about Football for Peace organization. So Football for Peace organization is the multidimensional education, research, and social engagement platform that uses sport to deliver value-based training. It's originally started in 2000, but now it has reached many international communities. They managed to support a wide range of activities around too many international communities. But in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic has forced a massive shift in day-to-day operation of the organization, especially regarding fund resources. So here we came with the idea of fund collaboration and support a project. Our project aims to generate a source of income over a long period of time, and at the same time provide a value-added services to the community in a sustainable fashion, And we set this objective to follow to reach the goal. So firstly, we want to reduce dependency on donor support and to increase local opportunity for generating funds. We have to understand, develop and implement community-based marketing and development approaches. Lastly, and most importantly, we want to initiate an online activities for Football for Peace at local and at global level for long-term organizational sustainability. Now, Daniel will continue with the more detail about the project.
So target groups are going to be children from communities with difficult backgrounds. There is some kind of discrimination or inequality inside the community or within the other communities. Our project activities will be online coaching and tuition, providing school equipment and merchandise, and providing access and equipment technologies for make online coaching easier for coaches and for communication. Output of the project are we suppose are going to be reduce inequality, break stereotypes, and expand interest and motivation. Now I will pass the word to Kajetan.
Yep. So I'm going to talk about project risks, contingency plans, collaboration, and additional thoughts. Could you go to the next slide, Rowan? Thank you. So the project risks and contingency plan. So the risks are in obtaining financial support from United Nations, possible COVID-19 mutations and restrictions, and also volunteer motivation. The contingency plan would be to implement the program online if possible. Collaboration-wise, we thought of collaborating with local or regional businesses, local schools, local community centers, or other NGOs if possible. Our additional thoughts are the success measured by evaluation. So we will measure success by evaluating with internal or external evaluators. We thought of the budget of like £30,000 to fulfill the project potential. So the project budget would be doubled from 15,000 into 30,000. And also, once we gain the grant from United Nations, we thought that we could contribute like £18,000 per project to deliver it in certain locations. And most of that money would basically cover the equipment like laptops, computers, modems, power generators, if there's no electricity, to try and run the project online. And also we could have like £60,000 from the fund to run projects in 3 different locations at the same time. That way we could reach more communities or more people. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, because you kept really well to time there. So thank you. Thank you, Rowan. Thank you, Kajetan, and thank you, Daniel. Anyone like to ask any questions of the team? Please put it in the chat or just raise your hand and unmute yourself. If not, I'm going to ask a question because I think it builds on what Morten said in the previous session or in the previous talk. How do you, and you mentioned, or Kajetan mentioned about international collaborations or working with other NGOs. How important do you think it would be to work with other NGOs in order to support the future of Football for Peace and identify funding?
So at the moment, because of the pandemic, it's quite difficult to obtain any kind of funding to ensure that the project somehow stabilizes itself through the pandemic. So the idea of obtaining the fund would be to try and implement what is usually done on the ground into like online world. Of the obvious limitations of that would be, if you want to work in a remote area that is kind of restricted in terms of electricity or equipment or even funds, implementing that online project would be difficult. Therefore, having that particular fund would be able to fund the sources or the resources that are needed to try and run the project.
Okay, thanks, Kajitan. I've seen that Vince has put his hand up. Vince, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thank you, thanks. Just a quick one. You mentioned about going online, which is great, and if it can be implemented in certain areas, I think that that is a way forward. But would you consider using esports, like online games, to bring the kids together, or would you develop a separate program?
To be honest with you, we haven't really thought about that. I guess we kind of focused on more on the global south rather than the local community, let's say, in the UK. So no, like we haven't thought about it.
Thanks, Vince. I thought it was a really, really good question. Really interesting. Anyone else got any other questions, or would Rowan or Daniel like to add anything to what's been asked? Silence. Bearing in mind the time, and if no one wants to ask another question, I think is a convenient place to hand over to the second team then, which is MSIS. So I don't know who is leading on this one. If you can get your slides ready, and I'll hand over to you.
Can you hear me good or not?
Yeah, good, Sven.
Okay, nice. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep, all good.
Great. So, yeah, we did a project for MSIS, and our project's name is Empowering Female Football Coaches and Players. Yeah, MSIS wants to use the power of football to solve social problems and change the world for to a better place. And yeah, our agenda is the project. After that, we state the key changes and the activities of the project, and yeah, then we focus on the target groups, and at the end we state one resume. Okay, so first of all, the main goals of our projects are of women and girls in sports. That is the same as the vision of our NGO. And yeah, our aim is contributed to the 5th Sustainable Development Goals. Yeah, that's, and yeah, our sub goal that is more directly into our project is to increase the number of female football coaches, and to make football 3 more popular. Yeah, now I give the word to Jitka.
Thanks. So the first change we want to get with our project is to increase the ratio of female coaches compared to male coaches. In other words, we want more women up leading position in sports, such as trainer or manager. The second change is by finding more women in sports leadership or coaching positions. We hope that more girls will also take up sports or soccer. And the last aspect is changing the mindset of the students who attend the conference. The activities are conferences. We will hold 2 conferences at different schools. The first conference will be about presenting the image of a female coach in a positive way. The careers of various famous female personalities who have become famous through football will be presented at each school so that girls can ask the questions at the end of the conference. In the second conference, the principle of football free is presented and the advantage of this type of football are explained to the pupils. The principle of football free is presented either through the use of videos or a short game in which the different phases of the game were explained to the students. A flyer is also distributed to show the students where they can play football free in their free time and what leagues there are in Poland. The two conferences are held back to back during normal school hours to reach as many students as possible. You can switch to other, yeah. So the target groups are girls in school aged from 6 to 18 years and their families, boys in schools as well, the same age from 6 to 18, because it can change their understanding of the stereotype as well. In general, it is for everyone, but the biggest beneficiary are girls in school. So now can Ismail continue?
Hi guys, can you hear me okay? Yeah, so the aim of the MSIS is to improve the level of involvement of women and girls in sport, whether it's playing a sport or coaching it. So what we've done is a SWOT analysis and PESO analysis, and it helped us to highlight the ongoing factors that lead to the lack of participation. And as we've narrowed down those factors, we have realized that a lack of female role models and coaches have led to a vicious cycle, whereby lack of role models create maybe a lack of interest for the sport. And unfortunately, that's where the participation amongst the females and girls is very low. What we can do is hold conferences in schools that educate school children and other members of the public about these ongoing issues. And hopefully we can inspire young girls or women to aspire to be a coach or increase their level of participation in sport. And also, the education can help change the stereotype that is attached to females in sport for young men and men, so that they can also help to make the females feel comfortable to participate in sport, whether it be a coach or a player. And yeah, that's our presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ismail. Thank you, Andrea, and Andrew, who's unable to speak today, and Sven. And thank you very much for keeping it to time. Perfect. I'm going to open it up to questions, but obviously, while you think of your questions, thank you very much. I will ask the first one just to give a bit of time. What I thought you did really well here is thinking about the social issues affecting participation of girls and young women in football, and you thought about the role models, and you thought about putting in a conference to actually talk about that before actually getting into the coaching aspect. Why did you think about doing it that way round? Why did you think about having a first conference to sort of talk about those social issues, or to highlight the role models?
Yes, so if I understand the question right, I think for us the bigger problem was the mindset of the people. So that yeah, we thought about that it is not the problem to become a female coach, but more the problem is more that people are thinking, if a woman is a coach, maybe respect, or yeah, it's hard to describe, but I think I hope you see what I mean. And yeah, so we thought that the bigger problem is the mindset of the students and of everyone. So we try to solve the problem that is bigger for us first, and after that we try to get them to come to us. Yeah, I hope this was an answer to your question, because it was kind of interrupted because my internet connection was a little bit bad. Sorry.
No worries, Sven. That makes sense. That you saw the mindset as being an issue and wanted to address that first. Hendrik has got his hand up, and then Onosh. So Hendrik first. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, just a short question. So you said it's only, or the main part is for the girls, and also there's a part for the boys to participate. Is it that the groups are mixed, so girls and boys together, or are they split up and just the girls and just the boys on the other hand?
Ismail, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was sorry, thank you. I would say that I believe it's better that the groups are mixed so that they can understand each other, understand the differences, and like we said with the first question, if they're there to understand what the issues are, and such as the stereotypes, if they can both understand each other's different point of views, then it can help them to work towards together, you know, maybe cancelling that out in the near future and kind of building positive relationships so that the females can increase their participation in sport. And even if they were to work together, maybe there could be like mixed classes where female coaches can take them. So yeah.
Thanks, Ismail. And Onosh, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, just maybe I just didn't catch it. Do you think that when you are trying to reach the primary school children, is the conference the right format to do it? They will be able to reach the children from 6 years old to, I don't know.
Yeah, it was hard for me to understand you, but I think I got your question. So yeah, conference, I don't think it's the perfectly right word for it, what we thought about. So it's more like kind of a lesson in school, which is interactive. So in the first lesson where yeah, female coaches are promoted, we get a professional football coach there, and she will tell the about her life and how she went from this position out of a schoolgirl to this position as a female coach. And so it's more like a story or yeah, kind of an interactive course. And the second conference where we try to improve Football 3, one option for us would be that someone is playing in a very short game how Football 3 is played. And this is more, yeah, maybe the conference is not the right term for it, but yeah, it was more an overall term. Yeah, we choose. Yeah.
I thought so.
Excellent, thanks, Onosh. Again, in the interest of time, we'll move on to the third group, which is INEX. So whoever is leading on that one, can you share your slides and then start your presentation?
Yep, can do. Shall I share the slides?
Yes, please, Vince, yeah.
Okay, I can start if you hear me. I'm pleased to present you our presentation. For the beginning, our project is situated in the first biggest city in Czech Republic, to Ostrava, as you can see in the picture. And the question is, why this project and why into Ostrava? So the reason is a deep divide between Roma people and Czech people. The first fact point is that Roma people have worse job opportunities. Unemployment is about 70 to 80%. The second point is about poor education system in native language. Romani was in 2017 teaching only at universities. And the third point is concentration of Roma people is highest around Ostrava and Ústí, and only 7% of the peoples continue at their studies after primary school. Yeah, and in this slide, you can see on the left side the highest criminality, high number of criminality in Australia. The general crimes is about 8,000. Yeah, robbery and house crime are also highest in this place. And on the right hand corner is map about unemployment. As you can see.
So this project is an innovation of an existing organisation. The organisation is INEX. The project name that we decided on was Active Life, Active Future, because we want to be able to encourage kids to become healthier, become more social through sport. The project location for the pilot that we want to do is a secondary school in Ostrava, but eventually we want to be able to branch out a little bit further as well and bring other schools in from different communities too. The target group of this project is children aged between 12 and 17. We feel like this is where we'll have the most impact. The children will understand the lessons that we're trying to teach them, and they'll be able to take it home or take it to their friends or anybody else that they may be in contact with and share it that way. And the vision of the organisation is basically to encourage people from across a target area to participate in fair play activities whilst understanding social issues. So we'll do that through the lessons that we teach them to create a more positive, social and safe environment for everybody involved. So we basically want to bring people together in fun and healthy ways. And because of this, well, we'll also be looking at the SDG 10, which is reduced inequalities. There are 4 main elements to this project. You've got element 1 and element 2, which kind of go hand in hand with each other. So you've got the weekly learning through sport sessions. So these sessions will be very interactive, educational games. So say we pick football as a sport. We'll use football to look at the social issues or the surrounding area and see how we can get the children to understand what's going on in their world and the world around them. And the second element is almost a non-sporting element to the project. So that we figured this way we could look at a wider population like this as well. So it would include dancing, art, singing, and it would be very much to support the sport side of it. So you can make banners and dance pieces to support teams and stuff like that as well. And then you've got element 3, which is celebration days. As you can see listed on the slide, there's different events during the year that we would inform the kids about and teach them about it, and then they'd be able to present things on the celebration days, and obviously they would also play sport on the celebration days as well, but it just gives them a better understanding again of what these particular days are about. And then you've got the 4th element, which is a 5-side friendly league. So we would include fair play rules in this. So children would get awarded points from each other for fair play. So that way they can either win a game or lose a game through fair play points, which is encouraging them to play in a less competitive way.
Sorry, somebody muted me. So our methodology, if I can go backwards, nope. Well, paint, there we are. Okay, methodology. We'll be looking at making everyone welcome. So it's an inclusive engagement with as many kids as we can, as you say, girls and boys. We want to look at sort of the gamification. So, ask questions around the games instead of telling them about things, trying to elicit from the students and let them correlate, the games that we play and social situations that they have within their communities. Look at redefining competition. You know, we try and look at more fair play, explore the new meanings of competing, and so have fair play in the game and in life. And look at having this sort of 80-20 split, 80% of the time focused on the players, playing and interacting, and 20% of the time explaining rules and discussing the various games. So that's sort of the ratio between the coaches and the kids. So 20% for the coaches, and then 80% focusing on the kids. And then sort of enjoy creativity. Think of different ways to play, to interact, and not only through sort of sport, but to play music, art, the events that we would organize, and even trips together. So you're creating a sort of more cohesive group, and trips could be to the local museums or to nature parks. And then it's sort of have fun together. An important way to create an environment where learning is fun and participatory. And then quickly looking at the sort of monitoring evaluation of the program, we'd have quantitative, sort of basic attendance records that help us split between the genders and the age range. They help us check, long term if we're on target. Then qualitative, it's important to understand how the participants see success. So we look at having some before, during, and after program questionnaires, tests, both written and verbal, with a selected number of questions coming from the participants themselves. Use of video diaries where snippets can be used for social media campaigns, with permission from the participants. And then at the end of the year or the terms, depending how it works, participants could be part of the program and they will lead a session to maybe, if we want to go to another school to introduce it, they can lead a session within a new environment, just so we can see if they've learned things and to make it more inclusive. And then we would look at some teacher engagement as well, just to see if they've noticed any behavioral changes in kids, positive or negative, just to see if the program's progressing how we want. And sort of aspirations moving forward, we would look at investigating with local partnerships, the municipalities, businesses, for funding, to help expand the program, say maybe expand to 2 other schools or so, depending on how the pilot program runs. And then advocate for more positive social safe spaces within the communities, because there is a lack of playing fields and sport fields, and those kind of social safe spaces. Potentially look at some social enterprise business, especially connected to the safe spaces. And then look at some more participant-led innovation, try and get them more involved in developing games, coming up with their own activities, monitoring our evaluation, maybe organizing events, giving them a small budget so they can learn some financial literacy at the same time. So that's our presentation. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free.
Thanks, Vince, Mary and Ali. Any questions? We have a couple of minutes for questions because you overran a little bit. I'll start with a question. It was very interesting that you brought in other, you talked about creativity, and Ali mentioned about dancing, art and singing. What was the importance of having non-sport or artistic type activities as part of this project?
For me, when you talk about sports and you introduce the concept of sports maybe in a schooling environment or a community environment, there's an unconscious bias of what people might perceive as sport. And so we wanted to be more inclusive and to try and get as many people involved as possible, because you don't want to create further divide or further fragmentation within the community because you're only involved sport.
Okay, thanks, Vince. Anyone got any other questions for the team? It was very comprehensive, so thank you for that.
Recording in progress.
Okay, no other questions. Well, thanks very much, Ali, Vince and Mary. We'll move on. Good, it's keeping this to time, which is pretty good, so we can move on. And the fourth and final group was the Football for Hope, Peace and Unity group. So whoever's leading on that one, can you share your screen and start your presentation? Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm just sharing my screen. I hope it works. Okay, so I hope it works. I'll just start. Yeah, so we developed the project Play, Learn, and Remember, so shortened PLAR, for the Ishami Foundation, which was called Football for Hope, Peace, and Unity earlier. So nowadays it's called the Ishami Foundation, which we used in this presentation as well. And to just give you a quick summarize of it, here's the map of Rwanda, and our project is located mainly in Kigali, which is the capital, and a little bit east of Kigali. So it's in the Togetherness Center in Hunini. And we chose this location because the organization already has strong bonds there, and the people there already know the organization. And the Togetherness Center is one center with a football pitch and on, so it's perfect for our project. The main goal of our project is, as well as the main goal of the organization, to raise awareness for the genocide that happened against the Tutsi in 1994 in Rwanda. And also we want to take the lessons out of Rwanda. So not just to take lessons from it inside Rwanda, but take it outside. And that's why we created this project. Yeah, the project will have a length of 3 weeks. It shows a short intensive course because there are already longer projects at the Ishami Foundation, and so we thought we will develop a new way to reach this main goal. And the target group is for people or for children from 13 to 17 years. So it was important for us to have old enough children to talk about things like the genocide, and mainly so the children are a little bit older to have the ability or to get to Rwanda. So from the UK to Rwanda, you have to be a little bit older, I guess. So it's this target group we are aiming at. And the whole project, I will give you a quick insight on what we are planning to do. It's going to have 3 phases. So in the first phase, the group from the UK will stay in the UK and have a quick workshop there, and to get to know each other and so on. And after that, they meet in Rwanda, where the main project is located. And related to the main goal, we want to learn from Rwanda. So the UK kids come to Rwanda and not the other way around. There will be some activities together, which are mainly playing football and workshops and so on. And in the third phase, the participants will go back to, so the group from the UK will go back to the UK and teach younger children there about the rules of playing, and take the learnings from the project. And maybe the younger kids they are teaching then maybe participants in the future of the project. To the activities.
Okay, hi everyone. Following on from what Hendrik has told you so far, we have our methodology and activities for the project as a whole. So what methodology are we going for? We're going for a project that ultimately enhances a values-based methodology, ultimately delivering a holistic model of coaching and the delivery of activities. I'll go through the specific activities in a second, but basically we want to try and implement morals such as positivity and positive relations, good citizenship and fair play, as many of these NGOs do. So this social and holistic development as such is learnt through physical activity and interrelation with other pupils. Okay, and they offer a varied insight into how people can work together, not just for skill development, but for social change, whether this be in a typically competitive environment or a more relaxed environment, such as some of the activities we offer. These can consist of off-pitch activities, such as leadership activities, trust games, and problem solving. And workshops, like Hendrik mentioned, this they do in the schools, storytelling, and this is really important for our project for spreading the awareness of the genocide in the past, to make sure that we're creating that everyone's aware of it, so this thing doesn't happen again. But then on pitch activities, we're using football as the tool, so using basic session plans with the use of teachable moments in this, and then a big game scenario at the end of each session, and hopefully a tournament at the end, which we can then judge to see if it's worked. In addition to this, then we have included the time of team bonding time, and this can even just be free time just to explore the local area in Kigali and getting to know the culture in the area. Cheers, Hendrik.
Yeah, my presentation just stopped. I'm trying to get the next slide. Ah, okay. Sorry. Okay.
I think you skipped one there, Hendrik.
Oh, sorry.
Don't worry, just think about time and just go from this one, Tom.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. All right. So moving on then, so to project risks. As with any project, there might be any risks that come up. So being a sensitive topic, we think our PLAR project could be viewed as offensive. Yeah, being sensitive, people might not want to talk about it, it will be remembered. So a solution to this, we would recruit Rwandan staff to ensure that it's a more comfortable environment and that anything's okay to talk about because they're okay to talk about it. A lack of interest. Again, as with many other things, people may not just want to participate. It could be due to personal beliefs or opinions or just what the program offers. And then funding. Potential stakeholders or people may not see the need of the project. So a solution to both of these points would just be to simply go into full depth into the project, our ethos, be really enthusiastic about it, and really offer the benefits of spreading this awareness, which is to have positive and more accepting communities.
Hi everyone, I say something about why it's relevant to have such a project and objectives. So maintain peace and build a more cohesive community and avoid future conflict. Next part is learn the lessons from the past, dangers of division and discrimination, bad politics and aftermath of the conflict. And next important factor for the community is awareness of genocide, and we would like to arouse children's interest in politics and be aware of importance of democracy. That's all for me.
Okay, so contingency plan. COVID-19 has impacted everything. So what we would do is with our session plans, we would adapt the games to be socially distanced. This can be used as such as making groups smaller and staying in the same groups so there's not any cross contamination. If COVID physically prevents the sessions from happening face to face, then we can give the participants resources such as session plans, physical session plans to complete at home or at the schools. This means they can still participate in the activities even without that physical presence of the project staff. And then depending also on the region and county, country, should I say, we can still deliver these off-pitch sessions such as the workshops and the team building activities, but through programs such as Zoom that we're doing now, you know, providing that they have the suitable internet and technology connections. Briefly, collaboration. So like Hendrik said, Patrick, our UK and Rwanda partnership schools, we're still yet to choose them, but with the Ishmi Foundation being linked with London, we aim to have a London school linked, and then in Rwanda as well. But being close to it as well and being football based, we would like to link with a football club, if possible, AS Kigali, to use their football stadium for our end of tournament, and hopefully get a link with them. And then obviously the existing members of the Schmidt Foundation, and who are also linked with them, they could also be a good partner.
I mean, thanks, Tom. We'll wrap up now just because of time. I mean, everyone can take a slide if there's anything else to add. Sorry about that. I'm just thinking of time. I'm going to ask a question. Obviously, anyone else would like to ask any other questions, and please raise your hands. My question really is about your point about the contingencies of COVID and whether that's actually could be an opportunity. Is there an opportunity for the people, and young people in particular in Rwanda, to actually educate those in London and the schools in London about the genocide against the Tutsi? And there's actually an opportunity for those interests to take place internationally rather than just within the groups within those dedicated geographies.
I'll just answer that. Yeah, I think I agree. And I think that's our ethos of the project, Mark, is to take it on an international level because it's seen that it's worked well in Rwanda. And then Eric himself has taken it to London. But yeah, you could say the benefit of having it online, you know, doesn't limit it then to just that group who are experiencing it. By making in like big conferences, you can extend that, you know, globally. And then, you know, that school doesn't necessarily just have to have that class participate, it can have the whole school. So yeah.
Wonderful, thanks Tom. Would anyone else like to ask a question? Sven's got his hand up, so we'll have this one. Oh,
just a quick one. Did you already thought about how you finance, or did you not thought about it yet?
Finance, that was our last slide, but it's fine because we hadn't exactly done the calculations exactly, but most of it we would hope to get not exactly free, but subsidized, because it's with the partnership schools, we hope the equipment we need would be provided by the schools. As such, the only real cost would be the transport and the accommodation prices for the UK students. Any like technical equipment extra, and all the legal and political things like your visas, your passports, really. But going off the Football for Pieces workings out, it probably would be around the similar. Well, depends really. I assume around a £10,000 budget, but that's what we would, if we were to, you know, take it on further. That's what we would work out for sure.
Okay, yeah, nice.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Sven. Vince, quick question, please, because it's time.
Very good. Just more an observation. Have you ever heard of the student-led TED Talks? It's an educational program that you could link into your online system, and they could video those, and then they can get showcased on the international TED Talk student-led platform. I think that's, you know, a project like yours and the stories that you have from the kids could fit into a platform like that very, very well. Just an observation. Thank you.
Thanks, Vince. I don't think it really requires a response. So that's a brilliant suggestion. Thanks very much. And it's brilliant because it keeps us to time. So we've got 5 minutes. So if we come back in 5 minutes, again, just move about. We don't want to have screen fatigue as usual. And then what we'll be doing when we come back at 3 o'clock UK time, 4 o'clock CET time, is the panel with Holly, Amanda, and Oscar. So if you go away, get some fresh air, get a drink or whatever, and we'll see you back in 5 minutes. Thanks very much. If Oscar, Holly, and I can see Holly coming on, that's good. Good to see you, Oscar. Holly, is Amanda online? Not yet.
Hi, good to see you too. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Hi,
Oscar.
I'm online.
Oh, hi, Amanda.
Hi,
How you doing?
Mark. I'm good, and you?
I'm good, thank you. Yeah, so you're here. That's good. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Do you have any slides that you want to share? Or
yes, I have some slides.
Okay, cool. What we'll do is, because we've got an hour, up to 10 minutes for your talk, so then we'll have some questions afterwards, and we'll open it up. Okay. And what we'll do, purely in terms of my writing down in alphabetical order, which was Amanda, then Holly, then Oscar, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's brilliant.
So we'll have Amanda first, then straight into Holly, then into Oscar, and then we'll have questions, okay? Feel free to have a couple of minutes break beforehand, and I'll give you a call. You know, I'll introduce you at the start, okay?
Mark,
Yeah.
I must confess, I'm not that well experienced with Zoom, so I might be a bit clumsy when it comes to sharing my screen, which is ironic considering the focus of the presentation. But bear with me if I might just say, Mark, what do I press?
I'm equally clumsy, so I might have to ask one of my expert colleagues elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Holly, if that helps, can you see a green button, an arrow at the bottom of your screen?
Yes.
Shared screen?
Yes.
So basically, you click on that, and then you choose the page you want to share, and off you go. Simple as that.
Well, cross fingers for me. Technology usually fails me massively, but we'll keep the fingers crossed.
In theory, that's the way it works, but that's when you try, you know, all sorts happen. So
thank you.
See you soon, guys.
See you soon.
Same way. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So we're into the second half of the conference. Thank you very much for your time, and in particular, thank you very much for all the students who presented in the last session. Obviously, this is part of the project was about them working with partners to develop some proposals and then presenting it back to the conference. So thank you very much. It's not always easy, but particularly online, but thank you very much. So the theme of the intensive course that the students have been doing a couple of months ago has been obviously the context that we find ourselves in, which is about sport for development peace as a sector, but within the context of COVID. So what we've asked is for 3 experts in the field, and just to ask for their sort of insights and recollections and sort of analysis about what COVID brings and what the future is likely to be. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to welcome Amanda Lima from the Laureus Foundation. So Morten mentioned her earlier. Holly Collison from Loughborough University, who's an expert in this particular area, particularly West Africa, and also Dr. Russell Mwaanga, who's founder of EduMove and also has worked in academia as well. What I'd like to do is start with Amanda purely on the basis of alphabetical order, then on to Holly, and then on to Oscar. They'll speak for up to 10 minutes each, then we'll have some questions afterwards. As before with the keynote, if you pop your questions in the chat, then we can ask them. So over to you, Amanda. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks so much. Let me try to share my screen with you all. Just a second, please. Can you all see my screen?
I can, yeah.
Yeah? Okay, good. Brilliant. Well, so first of all, I'd like to thank Mark and Tom for inviting me to be here today. I'm very happy. As Mark said, my name is Amanda Lima. I'm alumni for University of Brighton. I did a master's degree in sports and international development a few years ago. I'm currently working for Laureus Sport for Good. I'm sure you heard all from my colleague Morten Schmidt earlier today. So my brief presentation will be based on some of the experiences, learnings, and stories that I've heard in the past 15 months across the sector. So starting with some of the negatives, the negative impact of COVID-19, all in-person sport activities were paused. So I think this was definitely the main one. So when you think about NGOs, schools, sport clubs, parks, social life in general, everything had to stop. And that caused a huge impact in the sector. Fundraising events were also cancelled or postponed. And for a number of organizations, they are very reliant on fundraising events in order to generate income for the organizations. So that was quite negative as well. Keeping contact with the participants of the event also was a challenge. Some of those organizations, they have loads of external partnerships where those partners, usually they are the ones with the responsibility of keeping contact with participants. And just at that point, they realize, you know, how impactful that was not to get that contact with the participants. There was also an increase in job loss. So huge negative impact, especially for those under informal employment. Some countries, they had very poor emergency financial support, or sometimes they were even inexistent. So some people, they suffered quite a lot with that. People from communities where usually sport for development organizations are linked to. There were a few studies as well around that indicate some of increase in domestic violence. That was a big thing as well, especially for women and children. So where in this scenario where families, they were spending more time together at home, under restriction rules, too much pressure, you know, causing distress. So unfortunately, there was a kind of an increase on that. In terms of some of the main challenges that we're seeing was that the delivery of online activity seems to be the most obvious option at the time. However, internet access for some areas, some communities seems, you know, to be a huge challenge. And also, I would say that not only the access to the internet, but sometimes the access to the device itself. So if you take a household as an example, that they would have one laptop to share amount, you know, parents were now working from home, or other assemblies that they were also, you know, taking classes from school in a virtual way. They had to organize how that would work. and not thinking about even those who didn't have access to internet or no access to the device at all as well. So organizations, they had to be very creative on the way that they would keep contact with the participants during that time. For those who had a good connection with internet and devices, and then Zoom fatigue hit really hard as well. So again, organizations, they had to become quite creative to try to understand what would be the most interesting elements to keep and maintain motivation level of participants as well. In terms of measurement of impact, that has been very difficult to measure social impacts, and especially related to behavior change, I would say, via online platforms. So some of the organizations, they report to us, you know, this new difficulty that they were facing in terms of, you know, some of them, most of them, they didn't have the right tools, or maybe, you know, the right knowledge of different methods to collect this data remotely. Also, there was an issue around some of the sport for development organizations tend to play, you know, a role that I would say maybe local authorities or even governments should be leading on, which was around, you know, humanitarian aid support. So that was a very tricky situation. You know, when organizations, they didn't have the appropriate training or maybe the appropriate skill set to act as a humanitarian organization. So perhaps they could do more harm than help. And so it was very hard for them to understand where they would stand. And keeping donors and sponsors engaged as well, seeking flexibility, especially around amending budget sheets and activities, that was a challenge. But, you know, the experience that we had, I think, was more positive than the negative. So now talking a little bit about the positive impacts, because we also, you know, could see some of the positive impacts caused by, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, is that some, you know, most of the organizations in that sector, they had to adapt really fast, and they have to be super creative on new activities delivery models, on how they would keep contact with participants. We also seen that organizations, they, you know, they managed to build much stronger relationships with the communities and participants. So they had to engage more with the families to try to understand how those families could support them and keep those participants engaged through online sessions and classes, as an example, you know. When activities in person or online, they were impossible. I think I'm talking more about, you know, around the beginning of the pandemic, when, you know, nobody knew exactly what to do and everything was paused. Some organizations, they were very proactive in terms of offering support for the in-house staff. They start to reveal loads of, you know, documents that sometimes when you are fully engaged on the day-to-day delivery of activities, sometimes you forget a little bit about. So we've seen organizations doing a great job in reviewing, even creating safeguarding policies, financial manuals, reviewing strategic plans as well. That was great. We also seeing organizations start to realize the importance of having specialists as well in the organization. So it's, you know, to deal with specific issues such as mental health or violence or social needs. Sometimes, you know, not all organizations that would have this kind of expertise in-house, and that was quite useful to have around the pandemic. There was also a great deal in collaboration among the sport for development organizations, you know, through campaigns, sharing forums, joint initiatives. I think sometimes when some of the organizations, they were seeing each other more as a competitors, you know, the pandemic kind of put them together to work together and create new things. Now, in terms of the future, I try to be very optimistic here. So I think, you know, I see that as a great opportunity for the sector to become more focused on measuring positive social impacts, especially in long terms. There's an opportunity to offer further collaboration. As I just mentioned, you know, some organizations, they're already seeing the benefits of working together. I think the relevance of the sport for development sector during the pandemic, you know, by engaging communities, what was great, was huge. And I truly hope that governments, donors, sponsors, especially the ones outside of the sports industry, could potentially devote more attention and resources into the sector. And I think those two last points in my presentation, I would say that I think that unlocking additional sources of income would not only allow the sector to undertake more robust kind of evidence based on its positive impacts, but it would also support further communities' engagement, and this gradually, hopefully, would strengthen the sector in the future. Yeah, that's me. Thank you, Mark.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Amanda. And over to you, Holly. Now, if you can share your screen. So
this is the big first test of the day.
First test. The green button at the bottom saying share screen. It looks like it's working. Yeah, perfect.
Do I need to do something else, or you can see what you need to see?
I think if you just share it like you would do if you were doing PowerPoint. So do the slideshow.
Oh.
Next, that's it.
Yeah?
Yeah, that looks good.
Excellent. Okay. Sorry for I thought it might be a little bit clumsy. That was better than I expected. So thank you firstly for inviting me today. It's wonderful to have these opportunities to connect with students and with colleagues. So it's wonderful. So my name is Dr. Holly Collison. I'm a senior lecturer based within the Institute for Sport Business at Loughborough University, and I'm based on their London campus. And what I'm going to be presenting today is actually some research that we've just finished, which was a project around sport for development and Olympic movement stakeholders. And this was a social network analysis. And what we were looking to do is try and understand better how relationships are formed and managed and nurtured, firstly from a European perspective, but secondly from an African perspective. So two different networks, and obviously they're crossovers. Now, this project actually started maybe just before the pandemic hit. So what we've actually ended up doing is much more COVID specific now than what it was imagined to be to begin with. So what I wanted to present to you was some of the data, because I think the data is really, really important, right? So the first thing that stakeholders from a European perspective spoke to us about was the struggle, okay? Ultimately, and I echo completely what Amanda's just presented there, often stakeholders spoke around creativity, collaboration, the need to adapt quickly, the need to have to be flexible, the need to maintain connections and create new ways of connecting, and then lastly, innovation. Now, some of these things we might think, oh, they're actually quite familiar to us, especially from a stakeholder perspective. These are things that stakeholders probably have to think about. But actually, what we found from stakeholders in Europe was this was a nightmare to begin with. This was a shock thing that happened through the system. And a lot of these things about innovation and flexibility and being different caused a lot of anxiety. So this wasn't like we're prepared for this. No one was prepared for this. But from a stakeholder perspective, this was a big traumatic disruption to the norm. And I think, stakeholders, they know what they're doing. They're intelligent groups of people that have similar shared goals and shared belief systems. But certainly it was about recognizing the opportunities, not being scared of the struggles, and having to just confront them. So this quote, for example, I thought was pretty good in terms of COVID was a nightmare for communities, for individuals. They had to react very quickly. And in some ways, sport for development was seen as secondary. So it wasn't necessarily about sport for development. It was about, right, what do our partners need? What are they telling us? And how can we support them in different ways? And that's really special. That's almost a special feature of what I think sport for development can provide, right? It's that affinity with other development sectors. Now that brings us to the next point that stakeholders brought to our attention. Was we're trying to do the same things, i.e. we're trying to stick to our shared values, we're trying to stick to some of our agendas in a broad term, but actually what do we do about the sporting community piece? Because often we rely on sporting communities to deliver our work, to recognise our work, and to sustain our work. We rely on that sporting community piece. So where once we were delivering messages through sport, we're now having to support other mechanisms to do that. And that's something very, very new. Now, as Amanda mentioned, being able to be adaptable and flexible, massively important in this context. And one of our stakeholders said that really well. If we're inflexible, if we are rigid, this is going to fail. So there was a very quick recognition of the fact we couldn't be overly structured with our approach to responding to COVID. We know we have to be flexible because we're all learning at the same time. So we have to start listening. And I think that was a consistency throughout the stakeholders we spoke to in Europe. We have to listen to our partners on the ground. We have to listen to the experts on the ground. We have to understand their new needs. What is it they need from us and how can we support that in different ways, not necessarily through sport. So that was a real recognition for the sports sector and sport for development sector as well. And I think it's interesting to look at this idea of we can't fail, so we have to adapt and we have to be flexible. Now, once people started talking about being adaptable and flexible, that word came in, which some people find very, very uncomfortable, this word of innovation. Now, I still struggle to define innovation. I think a lot of people do, right? But there's a new expectation that we have to be innovative. We have to keep going. We have to change things. We have to respond to new trends, new sports ways, new development practices, new ways of thinking. But that can cause a lot of resistance, can cause a lot of anxiety, because what does that mean? And we don't have our go-to thing. We don't have our sport community piece to hold on to. So again, another stakeholder was describing this, and naturally a lot of our organizations have gone to some sort of virtual or online delivery in different ways. So we're trying to be innovative. The piece for me there is the sort of virtual. We had the idea that people were kind of playing with this virtual space to see what the possibilities are. But this innovation thing kept creeping into the conversation. So a big consequence of COVID was having to come out of the comfort zone of sport and find even new ways to deliver messages, new ways to communicate, new ways to engage, and also virtually new ways to support physical activity. And a lot of that came from virtual means. Now, with a twist to that, I'm going to intersect from another research project. So if you think about the context I've just delivered, which is about stakeholder viewpoints in Europe, I've also been involved with a project around eSport. Now, you'll tell from my anxiety about even being able to share my slides with you today, I am not the eSport person. So if you have questions about specific eSport, I'm not the person to ask. However, gaming and eSport is something I have been unable to avoid in my recent research career, okay? So gaming and eSports has provided a mechanism for people to socialise during a period when governments have enforced lockdown, restrictions on social interaction and mobility. So we have to look for other means and mechanisms. the World Health Organization created a new initiative called Play a Part Together. Okay, and this is in collaboration with several esport gaming industry leaders. So whilst the World Health Organization had been very resistant to endorse esport due to online addictions and different health risks, actually COVID kind of allowed people to be a little bit looser with their ideas, adaptable, flexible, creative connectivity. So what the World Health Organization did was it used esport to deliver health guidance about hand washing, social distancing, staying at home through the playing esport. So esport and SDP. Now, I am probably one of those traditional SDP scholars that have been quite, again, resistant to the idea of esport coming into the space. But we're recognizing more and more that this is being picked up. So the United Nations Environment Programme, for example, have launched another program about playing for planet alliances and understanding, part of the UN Climate Summit. Another industry, Minecraft, asked its users to create their own coral reefs, for example, and their little coral blocks. And the enthusiasm behind this triggered a massive movement towards nature conservatory for coral reefs. And the SDP movement is slowly picking up on these initiatives and collaborations with esport and gaming industries. So could this be a form of digital mediation? Possibly, and this is what I'm kind of asking questions more than giving solutions here. So for example, in April 2021, the IOC outlined their plans for an Olympic virtual series. How can we adapt? How can we be creative? How can we continue to deliver positive messages in our value systems through people that maybe our sporting communities are slightly fractured at the moment? Different ways of engagement, and just being different, because we probably need to be right now.
Can you move to wrapping up, Holly? Just a bit of time, thanks.
Nearly there. So esport and the digital divide is another thing that COVID has certainly exposed, this idea of the digital divide. And again, we have in the UK, we have Digital Schoolhouse, which is collaborated with Nintendo. They do education through using esport. They do big sports competitions within schools. And again, it's about social connections, communication, and teamwork. Possibly a time for reflection in the SDP sector. So European stakeholders highlighted the struggle, identity in the absence of sporting communities, forced adaptation, and going sort of virtual. SDP and innovation, question mark, COVID and forced innovation. How do we cope with that? And then finally, esport and SDP, something a little bit new. The questions are there. Can the sort of be developed and maintained post-COVID? And can new sports communities be embraced? Thank you.
Thanks, Holly. And finally, Oscar, if you could, Holly, you'll need to stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, got it.
And then over to you, Oscar. If you can share your slides.
Hello, can you hear me, Mike?
Yeah, I can hear you, Oscar. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you. Well, Mike, I don't have any slides to share. I am just going to have a conversation, really. So thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this webinar, and to this wonderful cast of colleagues, Amanda and Holly. What I'll just try to do in my 10 minutes is just to try and bring in another perspective to this question. What do we see as the future of SDP? Well, I want to flip that a little bit and say, what future can we create from lessons that we have got from the pandemic? What can we create? That's what I want to focus on. And then I'll ask this question of saying, when we look into this future, what lenses are we using? What are we going to be looking? What are we going to use to see into this future based on what COVID has exposed, COVID-19 has exposed? Now, when we use the word exposed, we clearly accept the fact that there is stuff that has been hidden. And now, if stuff has been hidden, then what kind of sport for development were we having pre-COVID? So pre-COVID, there was a predominant sport for development drive, which was about a conformist kind of agenda. There is no inequality in the world. Everything is all right, so you can just have a project and things will just go on like that. But COVID says no. COVID says there are inequalities in the world. We have to choose now going forward. Do we want to continue with a soft touch sport for development where everything is all rosy, or do we want to engage with the difficult questions that others have to do to engage? Now, my background is such that I wear a different hat. So at the turn of the century, when I started to drive the work of sport for development in sub-Saharan Africa, we were responding to the HIV/AIDS epidemic. That is how we started our work in Zambia and in Southern Africa. Now, something about the HIV/AIDS epidemic was that it was happening in Africa. So there was this global perception that these are things that happen in Africa. COVID says, actually, we are a global village. We need to start thinking as a global village. We need to start thinking that development is not something that we impose on the global south. Development is something that we do together. So then the question is, how do we move forward to create this future? So it's such a profound question, but I'll try and answer a few things regarding that question. So number one, we have the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 agenda as a framework for us to start responding to this. It has been a document which has sat there, like many other documents, the Millennium Development Goals. It's something that was there, but the Sport for Development Office at the Commonwealth have given us some good head start, helping us to understand that we can begin to target our work. We can begin to move the agenda from sports is a solution for everything to sports addresses some particular things, and it doesn't address other things. Now, the things that sport doesn't address opens up a possibility for partnership. So the people in other sectors, maybe people in music, people in art, can begin to address those particular things that sport doesn't address. That becomes an authentic partnership as opposed to sport does everything. So the Sustainable Goals framework is a blueprint that is not like the previous Millennium Development Goals, which were really about an agenda created in the North for development that was going to happen in the South. This blueprint now, for me, is a possibility to help us respond to this disruption, to help us to have a kind of a map to go forward. What does this do? One example, for instance, when we talk about climate change, the countries like Canada, for instance, that are using this in the global North, the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework, will now start to collaborate maybe on tree planting with Ethiopia. So when Canada is working on tree planting with Ethiopia, it's not Canada telling Ethiopia what to do. It's Canada saying we need to plant trees in the world together. So that changes the dynamic. We are in one global village. We need trees for us to sustain ourselves. So that moves us away from pre-COVID, where there was always, I'm telling you what development is all about, you have to respond. So this framework does hopefully move us in a different direction. What is the other opportunity that we have through the framework? Well, using this framework, we can begin to imagine differently. And I think the sector has lacked imagination. We can begin to imagine a future where we are all accountable. We can begin to create a framework of ethics using Sustainable Development Goals, as opposed to, when we used to parachute people into, communities in the global South and they've got a solution all the time. This time, we are going to be expecting a framework that can help us to imagine what is the ethics of developmental engagement, that we can work together. And this is not going to be England telling Cameroon what to do. This will be England and Cameroon agreeing based on what is possible in that. So I'm really talking about giving a chance to a decolonizing framework in the way we engage in our work. And the decolonizing framework for me says, first of all, it's an acknowledgement that there is coloniality in the work that we do. So the word, coloniality is really about understanding that, for us, there's always this power dynamics. There's always this idea that there are inequalities that are historically constructed because of colonialism that tend to repackage themselves in our present times, and we need to address them. And unless we begin to address them, we're not being authentic to the truth that exists among us. So we need to start thinking, how can the future of sport for development begin to thrive using decolonization as a framework? What are the difficult questions we're going to have to deal with? We can't avoid them because the people in the global South, they don't have this opportunity of saying, I'm coming out of my closet. They're out of their closet. They deal with these things. In the global North, we are uncomfortable sometimes to ask these questions because somebody's going to feel uncomfortable. Well, the majority of the world are dealing with these things on daily basis. So we need to start looking at this framework and really giving it a chance. What does it mean to thrive on this, not just a conformist perspective of sport for development, but a perspective that is critical, where we are really engaging on these critical questions around poverty, gender disempowerment. Where are these coming from historically and in our present times? So to summarize, when we are looking at this decolonial framework, I think we're doing two things really, where we're going to be looking at one side, what you would call the deconstructive side of it. And by the deconstructive side, we're saying we need to acknowledge that power plays out in our sector. We need to acknowledge that there's a dominance of Euro and North American centric worldviews in everything that we do in sport for development. We need to acknowledge that the marginalized, there's a marginalization of voices, not just people of other ethnicities other than white, but women, disabled people. There is a marginalization of those voices. Now, it's not just bringing them in because we need to bring numbers that are, but it's about perspectives. It's a conviction we have that knowledge is created over space and time. And if we are going to be in this beautiful emerging garden of sport for development where we have diversity, then we're going to be bringing in all these perspectives from all these places. And I think we're going to do well if we do that. So the fourth point about the deconstructive side of decoloniality is to recognize our own position in power relations, which we often talk about as critical reflexivity. We need to come out and talk freely about our positionality. We need to talk about the baggage we bring into this space. As an African man, there is a way I've been educated which is not in keeping with gender empowerment. So when I bring that to that space, I bring both my vulnerabilities and I bring my strength, but I'm open to relearning in this space. So when we talk about the reconstructive side of the decoloniality framework, we're talking about addressing different hierarchies of power and how they get entangled in the space that we find ourselves. We're talking about promoting an authentic participatory and co-learning approach and engaging in plurality in the ways we do things. Accepting the fact that knowledge is not just in the North, but there is this plurality of knowledge which we need to embrace. It's also about developing and drawing on marginalized knowledges and silenced voices. It's about this idea of saying, can we welcome other ways of knowing? I come from Southern Africa, and in Southern Africa, we have a rich culture tradition called Ubuntu. What would Ubuntu do in constructing a new sport for development agenda? This is the agenda that Mandela and Dr. Kenneth Kaunda, who we recently lost, who was a friend of Mandela, who is, we have a funeral in Zambia for him. When these men and women of the African continent began to preach Ubuntu, Ubuntu was, I am because we are. My humanity is completed in you. It's like the Indian Namaste. I see myself in you. Without you, I am not. These ideologies need to be given an opportunity in that new way of thinking of sport for development. And I believe that, you know, there is a lot of richness that needs to be allowed to come to that space. And when we do that, maybe we'll begin to see a different sport for development. There's an opportunity, definitely. I could have gone on to speak, but I think Holly did touch on innovation, you know, and this touches also about the knowledges. When we started to construct movement games to teach about HIV/AIDS in Zambia, I have moved on that agenda to use the same movement games to teach mathematics in schools here in England. Now that started in Zambia. Now the question you have to ask was that 20 years ago, why wasn't that given an opportunity? Why weren't we listening that innovation could come out of Zambia? So again, it's not just innovation, but it is who is innovating. You know, how are we positioning ourselves to actually embrace other knowledges? It comes back to the fundamental convictions of what we believe knowledge is all about and whose knowledge counts more. And how that needs to be disrupted. You know what, I'm going to stop there because I didn't have PowerPoint slides, so then I could just keep going. But yeah, I'll end there, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Oscar. That was brilliant, and thank you for keeping the time. And so we're going to open up to questions. I've noticed there's quite a few coming in the chat. What I was thinking is there's a question for Amanda and then one for Holly. So Amanda, Nicola, actually, no, it's probably easy if I just read them, isn't it? So, Amanda, have you seen any really noteworthy creative solutions or innovations, particularly in the delivery models or home-based learning, particularly given the constraints around access?
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Nicola, for the question. I think what we're seeing quite a lot was organizations being very focused on context and content. Focus more on the audience that they were working, they were, you know, targeting at the time. I think what is more valid to say, rather than give specific examples, that is very, you know, local context focus, was more interesting to see how they were understanding better the audience. So as an example, when they start to think about, okay, we need to deliver activities online now. So they start to realize that they might probably would have to be very diverse on their online platforms that they might would choose, because over the summer they realized that Facebook is very interesting for one target audience or for a specific age group, where Instagram would work better for others. So for, you know, those participants who maybe would not have access to the internet, through lives, that now, you know, Instagram lives is very popular. So they start to understand that, okay, maybe we need to, you know, post those recording videos on YouTube channels or learning channels. So the content, the class would be there for whenever the participant has the access, you know, to access material. So we started to see, you know, loads of creativity around online platforms and the way that they was delivering those activities in such a way. We're seeing as well loads of opportunities for esports interactions. So, you know, countries putting kids together to take a competition that maybe, you know, without the virtual life, they wouldn't be able to, or would be much harder for them to, you know, get together. So that was quite interesting to see as well. And in terms of, you know, those who didn't have any access, we saw some organizations doing something that was quite interesting, that they were pretty much supporting some of these humanitarian aid organizations that I mentioned before, by delivering some of the food basket as an example. So by doing that, by helping communities, there were still an opportunity for them to check on, you know, participants, families, communities, to see how they were doing, if they were fine. And then there were slipping some of the booklets and kind of leaflets, you know, with some sports activities, physical activities, where people, they could still do these kind of things at home. So I think this was quite interesting to see. And yeah, I don't want to extend too much. There's loads of examples, but I think this is the ones that's coming to mind at the moment.
Thanks, Amanda. We've got a question for Holly, then I'll ask two to Oscar. Okay, so Holly, I mean, this is from Marie, who asked, so that you mentioned about stakeholders had to listen to people on the ground, had to listen to the grassroots experts. How was it like? What was it like before? Was it top down? Shouldn't stakeholders always listen and react to what's happening on the ground? And I think the key bit here is, do you think the relationship has changed for good, or do you think it will revert back?
Oh, that's a loaded question, which is a very good question. But I will say, I think European stakeholders generally have done a lot of learning over the last few years in how to create positive collaborations and listen to each other. There's been a lot of progress in that regards. What COVID has done is ripped off the curriculums from the wall and the models of delivery from the wall and the shared agendas, and they've had to start again. And what's happened is a lot of stakeholders have gone through their existing networks and their existing partnerships and said, right, what do you need? Well, usually we deliver this through schools or through trainer to trainer learning or something like that. Schools are closed. We don't have access to trainers. Okay, we need to come up with something new. How do you think it's best to deliver these services? What do you need now in your communities? Well, we need food. We need to be able to reinforce messages around COVID. Okay, perfect. That can fit into our value system of our group, of our organization. How do we now do that? How can you best do that in your position, in your community? Well, we could collaborate with this organization, this local organization. We need funds to do this and to get these certain resources. So it's constantly going, well, what do you need? How can you now do that? How can we support you? It's shifted the power dynamic a little bit in that regards, and European stakeholders have been forced, again, that disruption point of COVID has created that new culture. Now, I dare say there's going to be some shift back when some kind of normality hits and people share similar realities. Having said that, I think European stakeholders, again, they are starting to be more reflective. And I think local partners now, what we've seen in our African networks and partners that we've spoken to, I think they're embracing this opportunity to steer certain agendas and to serve their communities in different ways. So I imagine there will be a bit of a shift, and I think a positive shift in that regard. So that would be my answer to that one.
Thanks, Holly. I noticed that there's a big question here from Vince. I'll not to skip over it, but just to give all the panelists an opportunity to answer a question. You asked Vince a question to Oscar. He said, when we talk about decolonisation, are we only talking about European decolonisation?
Okay, yeah, so sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. No, we're not. We're not talking about only European decolonization. Decolonization is contested, has a contested conceptualization. So for me, it's a welcome contest. What I think we need to be asking ourselves is, when we define decolonization in a particular way, what are we trying to get out of it? How do we use it to then move forward the agenda that we have? So it's important for myself, when I engage in decolonization work, to be explicit about how I conceptualize it, so that I can enable conversation to happen. So I am not really limiting it to European colonization. I see colonization from this idea of what has been called metacoloniality, to just show the distinction between classical and historical colonialism and colonialism as it manifests in our present day. So this idea of metacoloniality is, the Greek word, the prefix meta, looking at, along with beyond. I therefore mean that metacolonialism is a social, political, economic, and cultural and psychological system that comes to play along to help us see what happens after the political colonization of states. So we are trying to understand how power plays out in our present days in the different hierarchies. And this all includes things around class, race, gender, sexuality, and disability. How does power play out in this? And when we look historically, how did that happen so that it can give us an insight to how to understand how it presents itself in our present time? So we're not limiting this to European colonialism, but we're using this as a framework for us to really try to understand power relations in our space, to try to understand how we can begin to envision a possibility of embracing other ways of knowing, how we can begin to relearn how we've engaged, because we've lost so much, to be honest. The fact that we've lost how the natives of, say, of Australia envisioned their connection with the environment. That could have been the answer of how we should think of how we engage sustainably with the earth. How the Canadian natives and the Africans engaged with the environment before imperialism. How did that happen? So the fact that we locked the door to that meant that knowledges were lost. We shut the door to this idea that actually knowledge is cumulative, learning is cumulative. We learn from one culture to the next and over time. So these doors that were shut because of particular interests of colonialism are the ones that we need to try to understand. And understanding European colonialism is just an opportunity for us to look into that.
Thanks very much, Oscar. And there's another question here. I'm conscious there's other people who've asked questions who've already asked questions. So I'm just going to go to Samuel now, which is another one for Oscar. Sharing your position. Sorry, about Ubuntu and Namaste and other global South perspectives of life. Do they have to fit into a global North agenda, or could we consider this movement being built in between a South-South relationship or a South-North one?
I have a story for you, because this is one of the things that we like to do in the Global South. We like stories. And our world is made of stories. Growing up, when I spent part of my life in the village, in the African village, and the fire was very important for us. So in the evening, we sat around the fire, and that's where the discussions happened. That's where you decided what you're going to plant. And it was interesting sometimes because women were invited to the fire. They didn't sit around the fire, but they sat close to the fire behind the men, but their voices were allowed in because there were some crops that women wanted to plant. Now, the idea of the fire for me is interesting because it depicts this idea that actually everyone seated around the fire has got a contribution and has got a worldview that they bring in. No one should take the place of the fire. It's almost like the fire, so this idea that, the global northern or the Eurocentric epistemologists took the place of the fire. That is what we're talking about here. It's decentering. So we leave the fire and we all sit around the fire and we enjoy the idea that you have a perspective from your culture, from your history that you bring around the fire, and it can be allowed. So nothing should be in the center. We need to decenter one particular form of knowledge so that all other forms of knowledge, all other forms of knowing, all other forms of engaging can actually be around that space. So to answer that, it's not really it's not really north-south. It's this belief that we need to start teaching ourselves that actually there is richness around all of us, and how we can imagine a support for development that allows for that. And my imagination is not good enough, but there is this conviction that we should have that there is a way of knowing, of engaging, that can allow voices to sit around and have that equal contribution. It might mean, listening better to those voices. It might mean new tools of engagement in our space, because these voices are still speaking and we're not listening. So it's not the voices, it's us who are maybe in particular places of power that need to listen differently. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Oscar. And I'm aware that Marie and Vince have asked other questions, but I'm just about to give everyone an opportunity to have a question. Tom's asked one here for all three. How do you see SDP adjusting to the shifting governmental priorities, reducing international development funds and aid money from governments in the global north, particularly from the UK? How will this change SDP networks and organisations? Will this be more reliance on corporations?
I'm happy to give a quick one to begin with. Firstly, really disappointed by the recent reduction in funding at the governmental level, and I'm sure a lot of organisations are brainstorming right now as how to respond and to create new pathways to secure funding from different areas. I will say, I think that European organisations, UK-based organisations are taking SDP into new development spaces, new corporate spaces anyway. The days of inviting people into SDP, seemingly there's a shift happening. And I know from certain leaders, they're saying, no, I want to be in their network. I don't want them to come to me necessarily. I want to go to them and I want to learn as much as possible from their organisational space, from their development space. So there's that shift happening there, and I think there's going to be some turns of different types of collaboration. And again, I think based on some of the stuff that I was talking about before, I think there's a reason people are becoming less resistant to things like esport. Why? Because it is a multi-billion-dollar industry annually, and they don't have a great reputation when it comes to CSR. So they're primed to give away a lot of money. And it's a new delivery mechanism that fits the situation right now, potentially for some. So yeah, I can see more corporate sponsorship happening in the long term. But I think that SDP stakeholders are intelligent enough to recognise the need to steer those relationships and to be cautious of the exploitation or corruption that can come with certain forms of relationships. So I think there's a cautious step towards that.
Yeah, I completely agree with Holly. My thinking is exactly in the same direction. The way I finished my presentation was pretty much trying to be very optimistic on the good impacts that the sport for development, could prove that the sector is capable of doing as well. That I think, before for us, inside of the sport industry, I think is quite obvious. But sometimes for people who are sitting outside of this industry, it's really hard for them to really understand the real impacts that sport can bring into people's life when you talk about positive impacts, because we also know that sport has the negative impacts of it. When I don't even need to list here all the negative impacts that sport can bring into people's life as well. But the sport for development is all about those positive impacts. And I think during the pandemic, the sector done a really good job on that. So I truly believe that if we are more resilient on how we're going to structure that and base those evidence in a more, structural way, I think you would be very well positioned to gain, further support and financial income come from external sources. That's what I hope.
I would like to think that, yes, it's disappointing that there's been a reduction in international development aid funds. From the African perspective, I would like to say it's an opportunity. I would like to appeal to my colleagues in Africa to say, you can't develop your community based on aid. Professor Dambisa Moyo, Dr. Dambisa Moyo wrote about dead aid, that there comes a time when it's not about aid, it's about creating opportunities. It's about finding ways of how you can, find new opportunities within your space. So here's one example that is possible to consider. So sport for development organizations in the Global South find themselves in a difficult space about where do they belong. Do they belong to sport federations, or do they belong to development organizations? Where do they really sit in the whole policy frameworks in that setup? There is an opportunity here now, for instance, that we know that physical activity does promote health, and it has great potential in terms of reducing non-communicable diseases in the future, diabetes type 2 and some particular cancers. We know that. So that knowledge and the evidence about the 10,000 steps recommended by World Health Organization, if an organization in the Global South goes to their Ministry of Education, of Health rather, and says, we don't have funding now, but we think that we have a case here for you to consider. We can actually promote health with you as a Ministry of Health, and this is where the evidence sits, and this is our innovation. Now, the Ministry of Health might have money allocated for that. It is possible they might have money allocated for that, and they'll be waiting for interventions that are convincing, that are efficacious for them to release that money. So there is a new opportunity there that we can begin to explore. And again, the work on sustainable development goals is a possibility to start to imagine that different trajectory in the way we need to be working in the future. So yeah, it's a disruption. But the other question, again, if you look at it from the Global North, is to ask our leaders in the Global North to say, if at time we can pull the plug in international development aid, were we with them? Were we really with them? Do you ever pull a plug for people in your country because you feel priorities have changed? When you do that, you gotta ask yourself, were we actually with them? You know, if we're in one global village, think of from your family perspective. You know, if something happens in your family and you're like, I'm not gonna support my son anymore, put the plug. What does that mean? Well, you were a family anyway. You know, so if we're a global village, you don't withdraw just because your priorities have shifted. You got to consult others and give them time to adjust to the situation which arises at a given time. Thank you.
Thank you for all three of you there. And I think it takes us to a perfect time just before the hour. So I would like you all to give a virtual thank you again to Amanda, to Oscar and to Holly. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure all you have as well. So thank you so much. What we'll do is we'll take another 5-minute break just to get some fresh air and some liquid or whatever we may need. We'll be returning in 5 minutes' time with my colleague Tom Carter chairing the session with Cora Burnett from South Africa presenting the final keynote for the conference. Thank you very much to Oscar, to Holly and to Amanda again, and we'll see you back in 5 minutes' time. Many thanks. Cheers.
Tom, I just want to see if I can get my PowerPoint to share. I'm a bit like I usually don't use Zoom, but anyway.
Cora, I'm leaving, so hi and bye. I'm jumping into another one. Good to see you. Good to see you, my sister. I hope you're well. I'm just jumping to another one. Really nice to see you.
You stole at least 3 of my good ideas, but
you always do that to me. You always you're like this sister with blaming mindset on a brother. You always do this.
No. There's no theft. This was done in collaboration, so therefore we're sharing.
She does that. Tom, she always does that. Trust me.
Oscar, I want to catch up again.
I will think on my feet on exploring more, but I honestly believe about in physical education, it's a focus on health optimizing physical education. And I think the challenge we're having, Oscar, is that the departments of education and departments of health are so separated and segmented. So, and people are saying that the government is supposed, we know in Africa, the government, is supposed to do many things that it's not going to do. So it's but what I like about your presentation is about the healthy conscious, collective consciousness that is really entering into the global space. Like last I completed a survey from Loughborough University, and I was thinking to myself, really? Are we having Olympic Games and we're competing for the best while the rest of the world is bleeding and dying, you know? So it's a really, and I like the personification of, and COVID said, COVID is having another song here.
Well, I have to jump into another webinar, so I hope to catch up with you soon, Cora, and take care.
Yeah, we will, definitely. Enjoy. I really enjoy. Okay, we'll have to touch more base.
Definitely. Okay, bye-bye then.
Thanks,
Great.
Doctor.
Hey, Cora. I think we would need Arnosh to yes, perfect. Then you can try your presentation.
Let me try.
Good to have you here, Cora.
Good to have you. Okay, let me just see here. Okay, this is the one. Okay, but I'm at the end. Maybe I should start at the beginning.
Well,
just scroll up. Yeah, perfect.
Yep.
Yes, there I
and then the full presentation.
And then full presentation. Yep.
Okay, let me just see. Okay, yeah, yours. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, all set.
How are you, Mari?
Fine. Enjoying the German summer, finally.
Having winter.
Yeah, I know. I just spoke to my friends in close to Cape Town recently, and she was also like, "It's so freezing." I was like, "Oh, I'm sweating," but I do enjoy the sun. So
yeah. But it's also relative. For us, 18 degrees is like very cold, and for you, okay, you can bear it.
Yeah.
No, I think I really enjoyed it up to now. I think it was really great. I don't know. I always get the last shift. You know, we had like a Commonwealth debate 3 years back, and they put me last. And at that stage, all the arguments were already taken. So I didn't know what to do. So I just said, okay, maybe I can change the question. My own argument. But now I'm going to my PowerPoint. I can't do that. But I think it is really, what I really think is really happening now is that I can pick up on most of the points as well. And we can just take it together. Anyway, thanks, Tom, to invite me. I really appreciate that.
Happy to have you, Cora. It's good. It's good to chat again. It's been a long time since you and I have talked.
Yeah, but sometimes you get us and dust us off, and then we get all alive from the show.
Oh, well, I'm buried under a pile of rubble anyway, so most of the time.
Yeah, good. No, it's cool. Yeah, no, I think it's really, I think it's really a time for new thinking and different thinking.
I agree.
Yeah, but interesting in how people phrase their new thinking with old concepts. Then you cannot divorce the old thinking with new thinking if it's conveyed through language.
Yeah.
And language already is loaded with meaning. So you cannot use old words for new meanings.
So should we?
Good point.
Because you express stuff, but he still has the baggage of previous meanings.
No questions, which raises the question whether we should even be talking about sport anymore.
Exactly. That thing called, the thing that used to be called sport. That phenomenon.
Yeah.
Interesting. But it's interesting how in communication you are stuck with vocabulary that ties you to older meanings.
Okay. Well, Cora, should we get started?
Good. I'm ready.
Okay. Right. Welcome back, everyone. This is the last session of this afternoon's GloKnoCo conference, our second conference of our entire GloKnoCo program. We will be having another conference again next year. Whether it will be online or not, we don't know. However, it is a great pleasure to introduce Professor Cora Burnett from the University of Johannesburg, if I remember correctly. I really should look up my notes before I do these things. And Cora, I've known Cora for some time, but I am very thrilled to have her provide her thoughts on the questions around the questions of COVID and SDP and what should happen after this. And again, Cora, if you would speak for approximately 30 minutes. If you go over a little, that's all right, because it's the last session or whatever, and then we'll open it up for questions as we have done in the past. So over
Fantastic.
to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Yeah, hello from a very cold global south, South Africa. And I can see people are having lovely summer, but the spirit is there. And I just told Tom that a few years back we had a debate, Commonwealth debate around sport for development. And the question was, would corruption in sport, elite sport, also have impact on the community sport? And as having been the last speaker, they took all my arguments. So I thought, okay, let me just change the question, and at least I can be innovative in my my answers. But today I will try and be still picking up what other people said, but I will not change the question, but I will try and bring some new understanding or some different understanding, or just emphasize understandings that have been expressed. So my structure of my presentation would be the insight from current research. I'm just touching base on the discourses. Being an academic, I mean, this is what I'm supposed to do, because I can see there are some of my PhD students also listening. Then looking at COVID manifestations in a very broad perspective. Then I think I'm also worked with Holly on the new report that you referred to, and talking about stakeholders, because it's about who is doing what, who's got the power. So stakeholders and stakeholding is very key. And I just read also in the chat box that Alan is saying, yeah, from the SSCN, Sport for Social Change Network, we want to have a seat around the table. And that is talking about stakeholder and stakeholding. And then I call it a new normal, because it's going to be our normal, but it's not going to be the old normal, but it definitely be a new normal for some years. And then I want to focus on somewhere the role of universities. And at least I think that is at least something different that hasn't been touched on today. So first of all, I'm just talking about what has been written in the past year, obviously not extensive, and I've just some references. In talking about new constructions, and then Oscar also emphasized health. And I've just done a national study on physical education, and learning from Brazil and from Australia, there is a whole movement into health optimizing physical education. It's called HOPE. And also looking at the health focus that COVID brings into our agenda. Also looking at the World Health Organization has been quoted more often than once, taking over to be an actor and a leader in the sport for development space. Then looking at partnerships, and then COVID effects, and I think everyone has probably read this Commonwealth Response Center report, talking about giving back better, preventing, mobilizing, return to play, the modification in my new normal understanding of normality, then building back better, which is the UN slogan. Then also a path of recovery, recognizing the struggle, and I think Holly also emphasized that the struggle it's a trauma that the whole global village is going through, and reconnecting and re-engaging and then reimagining, and all of those in not a very, I would say, linear fashion is happening at the same time at different levels. And then obviously the effects and strategic positioning on the report that Holly referred to, that I will just refer briefly. So if we look at what are the main manifestations of COVID, in the beginning, yes, it was effects, and then over time it became a habit, like it's already infiltrating our minds, our mindsets, and we are always, and still even today, confronted with the unknown. People are debating in my society with should they go for vaccines, with the fear, the anxiety, the unknown is always with us. And at the rate that people have lost families, have lost friends, very little physical activity, poverty is increased. So there's so many unknowns that still bring a lot of anxiety and fear at various levels. Then the isolation, the increase of inequalities. I think the COVID became a lens that we could see the fault lines much more clearly. As budgets are cut, who are suffering most? The impoverished, the women, the children, the more vulnerable. Then we're talking about what is working, why it's working, and getting these critical questions. And then, as Oscar also said, there are lots of wonderful, amazing opportunities that's going to give us new direction that's already taking place. And then how are we going to have a new normal? Because we couldn't, and I think it was like apartheid. You don't want it back. It enslaved so many people, and it was so cruel. So in this inequality, this inhumane world, where sport and most of our funding went to competitive sport, it was not a humane setup. So maybe the recalibration after COVID is going to give us new perspective of being more democratic, more open, more willing to listen, more civic-minded. And that, I think, it's that COVID has bring to us. And if we can just name it and understand it, maybe we can set new trends. So at the organizational perspective, and it's mostly the NGOs, many closed down. The smaller ones just couldn't survive. Then others went just permanently in the coping mode, and some just went into reinventing themselves. So first of all, I'm going to talk about emergency responses, then how people operate in the survival mode. Then what are they using? What did people do in the time out? Because it was also a time to get still, a time to really think, to re-strategize. And then I will just identify some of the trends that I picked up from the different sectors, government sector, NGO sector, etc. So first of all, in the emergency time, the NGOs were so well positioned, they became the foot soldiers. As the society became infected with the virus, literally and figuratively, they were the blood in the veins of society. Governments couldn't deliver in Africa. Many governments couldn't, but they could turn to the NGOs and say, we need you to reach the communities. And that was a wonderful, I think, amazing positioning of NGOs in that sector. So instead of lamenting that they became now aid bearers, it was an opportunity for them to get meaningful delivery on the needs of society. So they became not society-based or community-based, but they became community-driven, and they entered into their communities, and there they had the value. So some of them started serving on community structures, COVID structures. They could be great advisors there. Then they also had access to relief funding. They could get some funding spread and keep on paying their staff, their volunteers, or their coaches. The challenge was that, and that is also being exposed by COVID, where people were driving numbers and driving figures. Some of them would have employed up to 70, 80 coaches, and then a budget cut down, and they couldn't keep on paying these people. It also exposed the exploitative nature of power struggles within the sector. And that could be addressed instead of just observing it. So we need to interrogate that and really expose it. Then a lot of our sport facilities were repurposed. So the NGOs assisted where they had before, for instance, they had to transfer some communities we talk about immigrants or foreigners or to different areas of temporary living. They could use sport facilities. It was a crazy time, and the NGOs made a lot of things possible by filtering it to the communities. There was a redirection, and there was a refunding. So there were emergency funding. People handed out food parcel. Immediately, some of the NGOs said, but just giving people food for now, it's not going to work. Let's think strategically and have gardens. Let's look at security in the long term. So there was always that kind of mindset that came to that actually was illuminated by COVID. Then safeguarding became a very key issue, also for the implementers. And often people think about NGOs, but they forget that really the heartthrob of NGOs are these thousands of volunteers unemployed youth that find meaning. I've just had a master's student and she was looking at the employability in employment, and she came to the conclusion that 65% of the people that volunteered had transferred skills, and we work on the theory of change and actually mentoring and sponsoring at the end, so that 65% could find employment in a high unemployment rate of about 70–80% in some of the communities. So there's a lot of possibility there, but it's about safeguarding also the people delivering the programs on the ground. Then creating an awareness, emergency care. People produce training material. They responded in a very, I think, I would not say innovative. Innovative is another word, but it's about need-based. Whatever needs to be done, they did it. So some came up with booklets, some came up with online sources. If people did have access, if they didn't have access, they had smaller groups, but they were very actually authentic about it. And then another NGO that went on air and they created media platforms, go through radio, and they really engaged with the youth. Then as the crisis deepened, there was redirection of funding, and many of the funders actually kept on paying the stipends. So there was, again, and I think Holly referred to that as well, a power shift. So instead of saying, this is the program, this is what you guys need to do, this is what we're going to measure, they will say, listen, what can we do? Can we hand out tablets? No, that's not going to work because we don't have connectivity. And also we've got load shedding. I remember I had an interview, halfway through the interview with a colleague in Zambia. I had load shedding and he had a power failure as well. I went to one of my friends and he also went around, and 10 minutes later, we just connected as if nothing has happened. So, I mean, these realities that we need to negotiate. Then there was a cut of expenditure, online activities where it was possible. Then what happened was very interesting is people started training their staff. They started to have more meetings, reaching out. Then there was, during various phases of lockdown, people reacted differently, but definitely moving towards more holism. And I've heard the first speaker saying from Laureus, yeah, but we should keep to our true nature of being a sport organization, or find meaning in being a partner within a more broader perspective. But what happened on the ground, as people, and Oscar also alerted us to that, instead of having HIV/AIDS and everyone's delivering on HIV/AIDS, then we have COVID and everyone's going to deliver COVID. What about the next wave and the next one? So people were saying, what is our true purpose here? But how can we really contribute? Sport is but one activity. What about assisting homework? Children were at school, many would be left behind. So they reacted in very meaningful ways and support, and had other programs or partnered with people with other programs. And then how did they use the time out? Many went back and said, who are we? There's this great organization in the Cape Town area, Waves for Change. They focus very much on safeguarding. They focus on referrals and emotional support, psychological support. And they were actually focusing on waves, surfing. But then all the beaches were closed and they said, well, we can't do that anymore. So we need to move into other sports sectors. And there's a bridging across different sectors and partnerships happening. So they rethink their core. What are we really here to do? Are we an NGO that we can also use sport, but in our core, what else can we do that can give the brand that we want? Another NGO that partnered with local government, they're having a sustainable plan that came up with blueprints that they can put in other NGOs as well. So people were thinking, what can we do? It's like spring cleaning. So what are our niche areas? Instead of doing everything and delivering and then AIDS and then COVID and then this, no, it's to really calibrate and finding and being introspective, streamlining and think, how do I position myself in the various policy frameworks that exist? Talking about sustainable development goals, talking about, but also being true to what really is possible and deliverable. So people found their identities. And also by finding the identities, they would find also meaningful partnerships. So also many of them said, okay, we need to adapt our program because we need to maybe develop new programs, design new programs, offer different services, looking at longevity, looking at income generation, but also seeing what is meaningful, what do my society or my communities will need after this, developing new products. And then most of them say, we've got to keep going. How do we keep going? Okay, we'll have online, we'll have social media, we'll have the print, we'll distribute. So if I look at many things, thousands of things that happened, I would say the biggest trend I find is in the strategy. People align themselves with other strategies, with policies, with development frameworks, with their government development plans. They look at structural changes. They think, okay, maybe I should partner with a health organization, a public health organization. Maybe I should actually partner with other kinds of local organizations and stakeholders. And they look at the practice that they want and they say, okay, we can't go it alone. We have to have partnerships. Asset-based, what can I deliver? Much more meaningful and say, what should I do? How do I dance to the tunes of others? Say, what can I really do? What is possible? What's feasible? So finding relevance, looking at compliance, look at real capacity, look at niche areas. What do I bring that's different to the table? Then the main thing that happened, and I think it's very positive, is connectivity. People realize instead of opening another branch and another branch and another branch and chasing numbers, they thought, okay, how can we partner across the sectors? And what are these issues about sustainability? Not thinking about the vocab that we get from the UN, but thinking about sustainability in terms of how do I sustain my organization? How do I sustain families? Then looking at holism, I think that is a positive, and many of our good NGOs also had that from the beginning. They don't see it in very segmented ways. They're looking at the whole child, the whole community, looking at the target populations, who are the most vulnerable, and then address the complexity of these issues, not gender-based violence. Oh, let's just get some nice passes to speak to men. No, really look at the root causes and throw many activities at one issue, not just one program per kind of issue. Then there was a big drive to evidence, monitoring, evaluation, learning systems to be in place, validation of data, getting knowledge out there, putting systems in place to deliver that, and then technology. So just some ideas that came to mind that speaks to the discourse as the trends actually develop is about society, and people are looking within ranges of sustainable development goals and not jump, oh, this sounds interesting, oh, this sounds interesting, but really streamline it, be much more strategic about it, looking at the ones that speak to people versus the ones that speak to other elements. Then in 2011, when GIZ came to South Africa, just after or around the FIFA World Cup, they came with a sport for development philosophy into Africa, and they partnered with 10 countries. And you can see the partnerships that happened is mostly the purple, the NGOs. But in Swaziland, Rwanda, for instance, South Africa and Ghana, there was always a segment of the yellow, which is the government sector. So it was like a hodgepodge. It was not really a planned way. It was kind of all over the place, how people actually collaborated. Even some federations took hold of this. It was a mismatch from the beginning. Then when everyone's talking about the closure of the Sport for Development and Peace, many of the NGOs didn't even know it existed. So what is that so significant? Isn't it not the symbolism that as we group the various stakeholders, we need to reconfigure now, because now Sport for Development is integrated across the UN sector. The World Health is coming on board, UNICEF, UNESCO, everyone is getting bits and pieces related. So there was an insecurity more than really a closure of a specific department, I would say. It's the integration, the cross-sectionality. I had arguments with Fred Coulter, for instance, and we realized that sport versus sport for development, there is boundaries, it's messy, it is sponsor just focusing on elite sport. I mean, as I said, I completed the survey last night and I asked myself, so Olympic sport, and the question what the IOC is now asking is, how relevant is the Olympic movement towards what is the value of sport in that perspective? So in the study that Holly also referred to, we had these kind of figurations of funders, facilitators, the implementers that we had 14 interviews in Europe and I did 14 in Africa. And you could see that you find people doing, they funded, they facilitated and implemented. They were in Africa, the Sport for Social Change Network and Laureus that were also kind of networking, but they sometimes are implementing, sometimes they're facilitating. So it's not clear cut. So the categories that we always utilize, it's not really happening. I'm glad Holly did some references. I'm just looking at how we had a network pictures and how we actually developed that. Now you can look at centrality and the strength of the ties, and you can see Europe is very well around the diamond, which means it's facilitator, funder, and implementer. Whereas Africa with the pink is also there's some centrality and people working together, organizations working together. Europe, very dense, very well connected. Africa, less dense, less well connected. And also looking at implementers being central. So, and then what was very concerning or very interesting, you would say that some are really not connected at all. So there's big challenges of connectivity and the sports sector seems to be very apart. So the National Olympic Committees would have a sport for development type of programs, but they will be implementing. Instead of being strategic, let the NGOs do the implementing. So there's a lot of possibilities. Now, this is what happened in Zambia in 2012 already, that the NGOs already strategized to become a network of power and they could negotiate access to programs, to funding collectively. So there were already coalitions forming in those days in a country like Zambia. Then we really know, and it's also touched by Laureus, that there is a high, in Africa, we've got 60% of our populations would be youth. And there's a high unemployment rate. Now, currently, it's about 63% in South Africa of youth under the age of 35 being unemployed. People go into volunteerism. So there will be a flood, millions of youth trying to get some access because the belief system there in the communities, if I can volunteer, I will get work and I will have an upwards trajectory if you look at the right. And if I don't, if I'm a volunteer, it's status conferring. If I'm not, I might slip into criminality. So there's going to be a flood of volunteers trying to go to the sector. Mounting evaluation already happening is participation, action, research, but also training, that local people can be trained to facilitate and to also assist with research. I'm so much again the global north come to Africa and mine data and then come and go and publish it in some open access journals where local researchers cannot even afford to pay the PhDs. So the generation of knowledge is so skewed. So it's go back to get real understanding, closing the loops, finding strategic information, having MER systems that is owned by organizations, understood so that can be meaningful information. How do we trace? If one organization is having tools and events and trainings and partnerships, how do we link the causality? It means that there's a space for us to engage as universities. Training for implementers, for field workers, for trainers at different levels. Then look at digital monitoring and evaluation, sending pictures, speaking 1,000 words as part of our MER systems. Then I really believe in looking at the vocabulary, and Oscar also alerted to this. If we look at a continuum of high risk and thriving, we should rather measure the smaller steps towards a continuum thinking and being conscious about high risk, medium, coping, resilience, and then thriving. So I think you can also make the understanding of what means it to be resilience. If we talk about values, it's so contextual. We will not last for one day in the heart of rural Africa. We're not resilient. We don't have the values that it need and the skills to survive there. So I think look at the levels, look at the organizations, look at causality, but mainly look at how can we find vocabulary and concepts that we can measure and understand in context. Also in terms, we're talking about robustness of evidence. My question is, yes, robust. What does it help if I can have all the statistical analysis? It doesn't mean anything. What is meaningful evaluation? If I have my implementers and they my role models, surely their values should mean something that I can compare my secondary school learners with. So if you look at coping abilities, where do I find my norms? Shouldn't we measure in context? Because I've got thousands of measurements and I'm trying to develop scales that we can measure and we can develop it within context. So if we look at universities, I mean, if you look at the picture at the, that's my last slide at the bottom, I collected 101 case studies because I realized just doing monitoring evaluation doesn't give me the depth of explorative research. So I packaged it, it's available if you want it for your classes. It's raw stories from different perspectives on people from Rwanda, talking about the genocide, because I had 10 children that I spoke to, lost 121 family members. So if we look at our universities, we say we do education training, we do research, we do community outreach. Can't we combine all of that? Instead of doing segmented stuff, let's do education and training, academic courses, short learning courses, certification, credit bearing to support sport for development piece, the whole sector. Look at research, relevance, strategic, looking at the body of knowledge that we create, and then also looking at praxis where we can be advocating, we can be vocal. For this publication, I put all the funding back into the people that gave me information, back into the communities. We need to be more about policy and help with policy development. We can close the loop, resource sharing, and then stakeholder engagement, that we can also cross the sectors and bring the various sectors together. So I think I've just made it, but my question is, how can we think about our new roles that we realize nobody knows better, but we all know different. And if we are so set in our knowledge base, we will never understand the difference. If you look at a picture in the top right, you can see a coach doing the translations from young boys. He's been trained in monitoring evaluation. He gets much more meaningful information and understanding than any researcher from a different background will get. So if we look at what is happening and we decide, okay, you can just get that, and we decide, okay, let's just be vigilant, but let's just learn from what is happening around us. Instead of being so set on what we know, get into the unknown and learn the unknown in new and meaningful ways. Okay, I think that's my little story.
Wow, for a little story that is broad and sweeping. Thank you very much, Cora. Can we have a round of virtual applause at least for her? There's been a couple of questions popping up as you've been talking, and I think in some ways you've addressed some of the questions that came up earlier, but I'm still going to start with a couple of them. One of the ones that came up in particular that you touched on, and that is, you touched on the direct link between vulnerable communities or individuals and NGOs highlighted during COVID. So what would your professional suggestions be for longitudinal relationships between academic research and communities mediated through the NGOs on the ground?
I think, again, it's a partnership, because in many universities, you've got outreach programs. So I would really pledge and say, I had, for instance, a partnership with Global Masters Program with Loughborough University and with Utrecht University. So we take all 15 students, and now they did research amongst NGOs, and they for free, because they need to access, the NGOs gave them access, and now we've got publications coming out, but we've got 15 students that are now orientating in how to do monitoring evaluation, how to conduct research. I think it's about partnerships, finding cost-effective ways, and then putting systems in place for monitoring evaluation, training people, short learning courses, getting funding from different sectors, but train people to do their own systems. And then once every 4 or 5 years, you go in with your students and you do an impact assessment, and then you take them through the whole thing of strategic planning. So you get your anthropologists or sociologists or psychologists, you put a team effort in, and then you take them with your management lecturers or students and take them through a strategic planning. I think it's partnerships. I think it's finding ways where we can assist and we can complement and have reciprocity.
Okay. I'm going to follow up on the question. This is a follow-up question as well from Bon Combat, but I'm going to change it slightly in that should the redirection of funding and resources then should there be a redirection of funding and resources between academia and NGOs and communities to achieve more sustainable and longevity of meaningful and impactful activities? In other words, instead of research monies going to universities, should that be considered part of the actual NGO's work, in which then the NGOs consult with academics as opposed to the other way around?
Yeah. In Africa, everything goes. So it's not one directional.
Okay.
I mean, Alan can also say from the SSCN, so what we did for them, and I think it's still a brilliant idea, is that we had universities package articles for them in a very simple way that the practitioners can understand, read, and learn from the academic world. So I think there's endless opportunities, but I think funding can be redirected. For instance, and I've got students here, if they get research funding, the cost-saving effect in doing research for or advise NGOs, and in Italy, there's a student, and I'm part of her panel, that they go to NGOs and actually they fund the research themselves from the university perspective, and then they assist the NGOs to write proposals for funding. So the evidence is there. So they package the evidence, they assist the NGOs, and that becomes part of their community outreach programs. So yes, I think it could be both ways. So giving access, but also NGOs should be able to approach universities and students and wherever they can find expertise in that field and working relationship.
Thank you. I've got a whole series of questions here to deal with. And looking at this, I'm gonna gloss over one or two here, but you mentioned that in some countries, governments do not do what they are supposed to do. With NGOs and even governments from other countries step in with financial support to help the population on the ground. However, on the other hand, foreign governments strengthen the inequality within those countries. So the question really then becomes, should, or maybe they shouldn't, I don't know, should stakeholders from the outside not focus on influencing their own governments in order to create changes, not only on the ground, but also at the macro level?
Of course. And there's one NGO that actually in COVID time, what they started doing, and even before, they started forming partnership with local municipalities. And then they built capacity within the municipalities. And now they are actually looking at becoming part and parcel of a system. And I think there's opportunities there. 14% of NGOs are delivering in our public school system. So governments, how do you fix a government? Because now politics it's a dirty game, because now new politicians, then the next ones come in. But I find that some of the local municipalities, they realize that they can't consult communities. I think it's through the NGO sector the consultation can happen. And also I think what can happen is there can be a partnership and say, here's a facility, we will use the facility, but in exchange we do this and that. So I think there could be partnerships that could lead to systemic change in the short term, but especially at the local level, because we know at the national and the international level, it's a different ballgame. But I think NGOs can really make systemic change at the local level. I had examples in Mozambique, for instance, that there was a lot of shame, blame, and using photo voice and exposing that the inequalities, and exposing the hazards in a community where local community actors actually came to the table and they did change something. So I think it's also what can sport do and what changes is possible. And we know systemic changes, it's very hard. But I think COVID gave us the opportunity to engage in partnerships. And if you are at the table, you can help develop the recipe. Otherwise, you will always be at the end and you will always have your hands out and getting the crumbs.
Okay. So following on from that then, what do you see the role of SDP stakeholders and where are their limitations in this then?
I think if we can go in, the biggest challenge we have is to pull in the sports sector. If we can negotiate with the IOC at various levels, even at the Commonwealth Secretariat level, we can, because now the Commonwealth's got also a social movement, a sport movement. If we can tap into those resources and say, instead of having in the country a National Olympic Committee where they roll out the Olympic value program, because Olympic values is not always relevant for everyone. So let's just have that program, but let you be strategic. And then the NGOs come and they filter the meaningful content. So instead of everyone trying to implement, let's engage in partnership and see who's the most, I would say, suitable and equipped to do the implementations. Even if you look at international volunteers, they can bring a lot of funding and a lot of fundraising to a community. But I think they should rather be the technical advisors and having local volunteers being the people really talking about and values, etc. But again, a lot of possibilities exist that bring in knowledge. I mean, Southern theories for me is non-negotiable if you look at the context we're living in. But it's finding partnerships and see who can bring what to the table. Then you can have meaningful partnerships between the sports sector, because they're also looking at athletes. They're looking at athletes who are vulnerable. They're looking at all the federations. So we could see how the NGO sector can contribute to the sports sector, can contribute to the health sector, can contribute to the educational sector. I think there's time for us at another level to have that negotiations and talks to see how can sport position themselves in different sectors and then bridge the sectors, especially at the local levels.
Okay. Let's see here. I'm trying to decide. Yeah. In terms of this, then what you're talking about, if we broaden this out even a little further, many of the problems that you've described were problems that pre-existed before COVID that have been exacerbated or made worse because of the global pandemic. So with the shifting priorities and with some of these changes that you're talking about, how can local grassroots organizations then be assured that attention is still drawn to those pre-existing problems? With all the talk of innovation and thinking in new ways, how does that actually address, in a sense, the old?
I think that the opportunity is now, because NGOs, in a sense, reinvented themselves. They are more sure of what they can do. They're more ready to collaborate. So they can be much more, I think, in a collective. They will have bargaining power, because it's been proven through COVID that they are the ones that infiltrate the communities. People are so much more aware. I think there's now a window of opportunity where there should be collectivity in the bargaining. So NGOs should come together, and that's already happening now. For the first time, COVID brought that. So looking at the vulnerability of NGOs, now during COVID, they realize that they are vulnerable. How do they survive? So they would say, okay, NGO A, you can bring that product for us. NGO B, maybe you can bring that. So in the end, they have coalitions and they can leverage off each other. So I think that the fault line of NGOs being vulnerable can be overcome with a development of coalitions and collectivity. And people saying, but let's look at social enterprise development. Let's look at different ways of engaging young people to get them more employable. So I think there's opportunities for coalitions. And I think that kind of systemic change can, to say, tap into the public health sector, because, I mean, they've been there. So look at a new kind of a morphed organization that would have different sections, that would have a public health awareness section, that would have different products that they can offer, but in a coalition, not going alone.
Okay. I've got a question here from Vince, really about some of the terminologies. Do you think the word partnerships conveys the understanding or meaning of equality between entities? And can that really be the case? Or do we need to define the type of partnership, because the term sounds nice, but like all terms, it can have an ambiguity or be politically loaded?
Absolutely. I think a partnership sounds very nice, but a partnership means that's equal but different. And a lot of partnerships, like in family life as well, the people that gives the money, they have the power. So I think if we can change the thinking around power and the thinking around that you only bring financial capital, but other partner or another stakeholder bring human capital, another stakeholder bring cultural capital. So if we can look at the capitals and we can say that, but you only give money, but that's a new way of thinking about the sector. But yes, I agree. Partnerships, it sounds nice, but they talk about strategic partners, implementing partners, immediately grading it and making some more important and some less important. But money is always where the power lies. It's either politics or money. These people are powerful because they can bring systemic changes, or they can say, well, we pull out the funding. So I think there's no time to change the vocabulary around power. And I like to talk about coalitions, because for me, it's everyone brings something different to the table, but without that spot on the table, you cannot deliver there. And I think the NGOs has got now the power to say, we bring civil society, we bring, in the era where civil society mindedness, the collectivity of thinking, the understanding, the humanism is now paramount, and they have the power to say that we as academia and people in powerful positions, they need to advocate for that there's a new insight in the value of NGOs and civil society representation. Yes, I think partnerships is loaded. I would rather go for stakeholders, and some talk about stake owner, stakeholder, but I think if the power and we look at a round table perspective, I mean, not Camelot, but it's a round table. Everyone is there and everyone delivers something different that is essential to the whole. I think it's about holistic thinking as well.
Okay. So in restructuring the power relationships that you've been talking about, then, what do you think NGOs and communities are lacking most to access funders and policymakers to make the NGOs' own long-term needs more heard and felt?
I think as long as NGOs are competing, they are less powerful. I think there's power in numbers. I think there's power in voices, collective voices. The challenge is that they're competing for the same pot of money. And instead of competing, they should find each other, like I showed that picture of Zambia, where they actually unionized more or less. I think if they can present, and I can easily, see 30, 40 NGOs coming with a great case to a social corporate strategic drive and say, okay, we can deliver on this strategic drive for you as a collective, because immediately they can be across a continent, they can be across a country, and they have the power of numbers. but I think it lies in the collectivity, in the collaboration, and that will breach, I think that will breach a lot of vulnerabilities within the sector.
Okay. So
and
in terms
an academic, a university with, because they can give you the proof that the programs work. They can measure the partnership. They can measure so many things. So I think it's evidence, producing evidence as people do things, so that you have the evidence base, you have the collective collaboration, partnership, and then you can really, I think, apply for funding and different sources of funding.
Okay. So what's been asked here then is, from your study on networking between SDP organizations in Europe and in Africa, based on your findings, would you then have, would your recommendations to the different types of, what would the recommendations to the different types of actors be in those two different situations of Europe and Africa? Or would they be different?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I think context is very important. And I think it would, no, but there is definitely a global trend across the sector. And we came up with, and now you can get the report, we can share the report with you. But what for me is concerning that the European organizations, and especially the networks like Laureus and even UNICEF, that they still control a lot of power because they are the funders, and but also the benefits is that they share a lot of learnings, but they don't take up the learnings from the African context. They share it, but now I hope COVID actually made them more sensitive that they would take up the learnings from Africa. The recommendation, I would think, is also lies in that they look at what is happening, and technology is one of the trends that's happening. Collaborations and cross-sector partnerships is happening. So it's also to look at sustainability in a different way, looking at doing it in a collective way, but also looking at delivering employability, looking at the youth. Because if you look at Paris 2024, what stakeholders need to come together so that youth can become more employable and employed. So you can make people employable, but again, it's the system who's going to employ it. And then you can see some NGOs learning from each other that they do placements. I mean, Nike, for instance, has got various stores in townships where they actually can place coaches. And you look at MySouth, they train people, they earn points, and they can place them. So looking at what is happening in the sector that's successful, and is also looking at partnerships across sectors. I think that is one of our recommendations, that partners, the government sector could reach into the sports sector could reach into the development sector, can reach into the health sector. So I think it's instead of thinking in segments, but thinking in an integrated way.
Okay. Are there any other further questions or comments for Professor Burnett or Professor Cora? She prefers to become.
I think I'm sitting in the dark. You all look like maybe I should put.
It has gotten dark in your house for some reason. Let
me just put the light on and you can think about a question. Okay, I'm back.
Okay, well, you're back, and I'm aware of the time, and we're 5 minutes to 5, and it looks like quite possibly, I think a little screen fatigue might have set in as people have been here for the 4 hours, and that's usually beyond most people's endurance now for screens and that sort of thing. So I would like to thank you very much for your presentation, Cora, and for your response to all of those very provocative questions and insightful questions. And if I could have one more sort of virtual round of applause for our last keynote speaker, Professor Cora Burnett.
Thanks for having me, and it's lovely to see lovely faces, and I just miss you all. I haven't been around. Just to travel, I would have given so much, because we're a red country, so we're just stuck here.
Yeah. what I would like to ask everyone who is here currently is, if you have not already, please fill out the form that is in the chat that provides the evidence that people have actually engaged with this conference and been involved with it for our own funders. Arnost, I believe you've just put that up again. Looking at that, in terms of that, thank you very much for everyone for your attention. The presentations by the speakers, with their permission, I believe we will do some editing and have those either up on the website or on the GloKnoCo's YouTube channel. Correct me if I'm wrong, Arnost, on that. So yes, these will become materials that also are available, which is part of the purpose of this conference, and part of the GloKnoCo project is actually compiling various materials and that sort of thing that become teachable resources available for everyone. So thank you again, Cora, for everything. I want to thank everyone else for their attendance and their questions, and hopefully their expanding knowledge from participating in this particular program today. And I look forward to seeing all of you again next year at our next GloKnoCo conference, whenever that might be. And hopefully we can actually do at least part of it in person next year. So
that'd be a luxury.
Yeah. So I also want to thank my colleagues, particularly Arnost and Marie and Mark, for their keeping everything running smoothly behind the scenes. That is also quite crucial for everything else. So thank you everyone for all of that.
Thank you for participating, everyone. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Enjoy your evening.
You too.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, thanks.
Come on.
Thank you.
Maria, I think you can stop the recording.